Hi guys, tonight we step through the heavy wooden gates of a medieval castle, and right away you feel the cold grip you like a claw. The walls are solid stone, the windows narrow slits, and every surface seems to breathe frost back into your bones. You rub your arms, exhaling clouds that hang in the air like tiny ghosts. And suddenly it hits you. These men were expected to sleep here, not for a weekend reenactment, but for months, sometimes years. You picture yourself curling up on a stone floor without central heating or even a decent glass window. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this night. But don't worry, I'll guide you gently, as if you're wrapped in the safest blanket of storytelling. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're awake enough, drop your location and the time of night where you are, because I love knowing where my sleepy travelers are listening from. Now, dim the lights, and let's step deeper into the frost of the Middle Ages. The first shock is the sheer cold of stone itself. Medieval castles, so often romanticized, were brutal refrigerators in winter. The thick walls trapped, not heat but chill, sucking warmth out of bodies. You run your hand across the damp masonry, and it comes away clammy, almost as if the stone were alive and drinking your body heat. A mainstream historical fact here. Most medieval castles lacked anything resembling insulation. They were defensive structures first, comfort palaces second. The massive walls, sometimes over 10 feet thick, kept out arrows but let the cold rain inside like an invisible tyrant. You wander along a corridor, noticing torches sputtering against drafts. Those arrow slits, so brilliant for shooting at enemies, also acted as endless funnels of icy wind. You imagine trying to sleep within earshot of such a slit, listening to a wind that howls as if mocking you. That sound would never quite fade into background noise. It would scrape at your ears through the night, reminding you that outside, winter lurked with teeth bared. Now for a quirky tidbit. Soldiers sometimes stuffed moss or even animal dung into cracks in the walls to cut drafts. Yes, imagine falling asleep next to your personal draft stopper that happened to smell suspiciously barn-like. It worked in a pinch, though, because once temperatures plummeted, nobody cared if it smelled like a stable as long as it stopped the icy breath of the night. And here's where scholarly disagreements creep in. Some historians argue whether soldiers truly slept in the stone corridors at all, or if they were routinely billeted in nearby wooden outbuildings or villages for warmth. The truth may be a mix. Certainly, garrisons did use interior rooms, but when space ran short, men camped wherever a floor existed. That might mean lying beneath a tapestry in the Great Hall, or wedging against a cold tower wall, praying that your teeth didn't chatter loud enough to wake your commander. You pause and imagine the sensory load. Boots squeaking on damp stone, smoke from a distant fire lingering in the hall, the tang of iron from weapons stacked nearby. The cold is not only a temperature, it's a taste, a smell, a physical pressure on your chest. Every inhale feels sharp. Each exhale condenses into frost on your cloak. Even the shadows are cold here, stretching long across the floor like frozen ink. It's worth pausing to consider what this meant psychologically. You try lying down, pressing cheek against the unyielding stone. There's no softness, no spring, just a wall of ancient geology. Comfort was never the point. Soldiers weren't meant to dream blissfully here. They were meant to endure. You might wrap a cloak around you, huddle in a corner, and hope your body heat didn't leach completely away by dawn. Imagine this routine night after night. To soften it, you'd scatter rushes or straw across the floor. But in a bare corridor like this, even that thin barrier sometimes failed. So your bones would grow familiar with hardness, your ears trained to the song of the cold. That was medieval sleep, a negotiation between exhaustion and survival. And what's almost comical in hindsight is the castle builders themselves. They knew the walls were freezing, yet they rarely designed with warmth in mind. Defense took priority. So soldiers were left improvising, sometimes stuffing cloaks into cracks, sometimes simply surrendering to numbness. Sleep was not about comfort. It was about collapsing into unconsciousness before your body protested too much. You can almost feel your eyelids sag as you picture the men lying side by side, wrapped in whatever fabrics they had, staring at a black ceiling with no relief in sight. The castle at night was silent except for the whistle of draughts and the occasional crackle of a dying torch. And as you let yourself drift with them, you understand that medieval nights were not for sweet dreams, they were lessons in resilience. The frozen stone walls were the first test, the first obstacle between you and survival. And somehow, men managed to live, fight, and even laugh here. That fact alone is oddly comforting, as you nestle deeper into your own bed, grateful for the heater humming softly nearby. You shuffle deeper into the keep, and at last your eyes adjust to a faint glow that seems warmer than the corridors. The glow comes from an enormous hearth, carved into the wall like the open mouth of some giant beast. Flames leap and collapse inside, hurling sparks upward, and you feel your frozen fingers twitch toward the heat. You sigh finally, a little relief. Castles may have been cold stone prisons, but one lifeline of warmth was the fire that never died. These fireplaces weren't decorative centerpieces, they were survival machines. A mainstream historical fact, medieval great halls were usually equipped with massive hearths that burned day and night through the winter. Keeping them lit wasn't just about cooking, it was about ensuring that soldiers, servants, and lords didn't turn into ice sculptures. Fires were tended around the clock, with guards or kitchen staff assigned to feed logs and poke embers. Letting one go out in January could mean a miserable, even deadly, scramble to relight it. Step closer, though, and you notice something ironic. The fire radiates comfort directly in front, but the hall behind you remains cold as a crypt. Heat escaped upward into rafters or drifted uselessly toward unglazed windows. You get a warm face and a frozen back at the same time. Imagine trying to sleep like that, rolling over in your cloak so one side thaws while the other side freezes. Here comes a quirky tidbit for you. Sometimes castle occupants threw entire bundles of herbs into the fire, not for warmth, but for the fragrance. Rosemary, thyme, and juniper helped mask the smell of sweaty soldiers and damp straw. The hall might reek of body odor, smoke, and horse dung, but a sudden whiff of juniper gave at least the illusion of civility. You chuckle, it's basically medieval Febreze. And this is where scholarly debates enter. Some researchers argue whether every castle maintained ever-burning fires, or if that's an exaggeration drawn from monastic traditions. In truth, smaller garrisons with limited wood supplies might have rationed flames, building them only during meals or in the evenings. Larger royal castles, though, had forests at their disposal, so the fires roared day and night. What's not disputed is the immense appetite of those hearths. A great hall might devour dozens of cartloads of wood in a single winter. Close your eyes and listen. The crackle of oak logs, the hiss when damp wood hits embers, the occasional thump as a soldier drops a fresh log onto the pile. Men gather in a semicircle around it, boots stretched out like roots soaking up warmth. Their armor glints orange, faces flushed by firelight. You stand among them, caught between gratitude and discomfort, because the heat is uneven, smoky, and sometimes stings your lungs more than it comforts your skin. Still, it's better than nothing. For centuries, fire meant life. Without it, winter campaigns were unimaginable. And in a castle, the hearth wasn't just warmth, it was also community. Storytelling unfolded here. Gossip traveled quicker than the flames themselves. You might hear a knight bragging of battles, a cook muttering about spoiled meat, or a monk chanting quietly while staring into the flames. The fire was a stage, and every soldier played his part. Imagine bedding down in this hall. Bodies sprawled around like spokes of a wheel, all angled toward the hearth. You might fall asleep to the rhythm of crackling wood, grateful that your toes had not turned blue. But you'd also dream lightly, because at any moment the fire tender might poke around, stir coals, or drop another branch with a bang. There's also the practical issue of smoke. Chimneys were primitive, and sometimes non-existent. Instead, smoke drifted freely upward, gathering under the roof like a grey fog. Your eyes would sting, your throat scratch, and your cloak absorbed the scent permanently. People today complain about smoky campfires, but back then it was a permanent perfume. One last thought for you, as the flames dance in your mind. The hearth was never just a tool. It became symbolic of authority. Whoever controlled the fire controlled the household. A lord could decide who sat closest, who slept within arm's reach, and who was shoved to the cold edge of the hall. Fire wasn't merely warmth, it was hierarchy manifested in glowing embers. So when you think of medieval soldiers surviving castle nights, remember these eternal fires. They didn't chase the cold away completely. They just held it at bay long enough for men to rest, eat, and dream of spring. And as you let the crackle lull you tonight, imagine the relief of a frozen soldier stretching hands toward heat, grateful for one more hour of borrowed warmth. You shuffle away from the hearth, cheeks glowing, only to feel the bite of cold return almost instantly. The warmth doesn't last long once you step into shadow. That's when you notice the floor beneath your boots. It isn't bare stone here. It crunches faintly, smells faintly of earth and mold, and gives the faintest cushion underfoot. You kneel, pinch a handful, and realize you're kneeling in rushes, reeds, and straw scattered across the flagstones. This wasn't random mess, this was bedding, insulation, and cleaning strategy all in one. A mainstream historical fact. Castles commonly spread layers of rushes or reeds across floors, both in great halls and sleeping areas. The purpose was partly practical, softer than stone, easier on boots and knees, and partly hygienic. The organic layer absorbed spills, scraps, and less savory things. Instead of mopping, servants would sweep it out and replace it periodically. Of course, periodically might mean once a season, not once a week. By then, you can imagine the cocktail of dust, insects, and food bits fermenting at your feet. You picture yourself trying to sleep on this floor, cloaked and curled up. There's no mattress, just a few inches of straw between your spine and unforgiving rock. At first, it feels almost pleasant, springy even. But then you roll over and notice prickles jabbing through your tunic, a sour scent rising, and the occasional scuttling of something alive in the straw. The romance of rustic bedding fades fast. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some castles, rushes weren't just sprinkled, but artfully arranged with herbs like lavender, mint, or meadowsweet woven in. These additions weren't purely for the nose. Some were believed to repel fleas and bad airs. Imagine lying down, breathing in the faint sweetness of lavender, even as rats squeaked nearby. It's like medieval aromatherapy, with a side order of pest control. But scholars still disagree on just how widespread this practice was. Did every soldier in every castle really sleep on straw? Or was it a luxury reserved for main halls and chambers, while lesser garrisons simply collapsed on bare stone? Some argue that rush-strewn halls were mainly aristocratic spaces, while soldiers in the barracks had rougher accommodations. Archaeological digs turn up fragments of reeds in unexpected places, suggesting the truth was patchier and more flexible than the tidy descriptions of chroniclers. Imagine the sensory load again. You lie on your back, looking up at a dark ceiling, smoke stains spreading like black vines. Your body sinks slightly into straw that creaks and rustles with every shift. Dust tickles your nose. You cough, and a faint herbal tang lingers in the air. The sound of soldiers breathing around you, mixed with the occasional squeal of a rat, makes the hall feel alive in a way that's more unsettling than comforting. And yet this was warmth, in a relative sense. Straw trapped a little body heat, insulated from stone, and even muffled noise. Bundled close with others, you'd almost convince yourself you had a bed. It wasn't luxury, but it was survival. There's something strangely poignant here. These men, trained to fight and kill, also became connoisseurs of humble comforts. A thicker straw layer, a fresher herb scent, a corner with fewer drafts. That was the currency of medieval sleep. Not feather mattresses or satin sheets, just an extra bundle of reeds to keep the chill from gnawing through your bones. So as you tuck yourself into your own bed tonight, remember the medieval soldier spreading his cloak across damp straw. He doesn't dream of castles of gold, he dreams of just a little more stuffing under his shoulder blades, a slightly sweeter scent in the rushes, and the hope that the rats keep to the shadows until morning. You wake with straw still clinging to your tunic, shift stiffly on the floor, and realize that bedding alone isn't enough. The stone walls sigh with frost. Your breath still fogs in front of you, and even the faint warmth from the hearth seems a world away. What kept you alive through a medieval night was not only where you slept, but what you wore. And here the lesson is simple: layers upon layers. Wool, fur, and whatever scraps of cloth you could beg or steal. A mainstream historical fact: wool was the workhorse fabric of the Middle Ages. Tough, insulating, and abundant from sheep, it was woven into cloaks, tunics, and blankets. Soldiers often slept in full woolen garb, tunic, hose, and a heavy cloak wrapped around like a cocoon. Unlike modern pajamas, these clothes doubled as daytime wear. You went to bed in the same outfit you wore on patrol, sometimes for weeks without change. Pull your cloak tighter, and you understand the strategy. It isn't elegance, it's insulation. Medieval people layered like onions. Undergarments of linen for skin comfort, woolens for warmth, and if fortune smiled, fur trim or lining stolen from animals more suited to cold than you. Fox, rabbit, sheep, even cat fur sometimes turned into collars and mittens. You might wrinkle your nose, but when your toes were numb, you didn't complain about fashion. Now for a quirky tidbit. Some men actually slept wearing their armor, at least partial pieces, during campaigns. Not the full plate, it was far too rigid, but chainmail hauberks or padded gambesons stayed on through the night. Why? Partly because it saved time in case of surprise attack, and partly because the thick padding trapped heat. Of course, you smelled like a damp horse stable after a week, but survival trumped hygiene every time. And here comes a debate among historians. Just how common were fur-lined garments for ordinary soldiers? Chronicles describe noblemen lounging in squirrel fur mantles and velvet-lined cloaks, but did rank-and-file troops have any chance at such luxury? Some scholars argue that common soldiers relied mostly on coarse wool, scavenged hides, or even patched-together rags. Others insist that armies, especially in Northern Europe, ensured every man had at least some fur edging for winter, given how lethal the cold could be. The truth likely depended on supply, rank, and luck. You pull the hood of a woolen cloak over your head and notice how much it helps. Medieval hoods covered not just the scalp but sometimes shoulders and chest, like a built-in scarf. Imagine lying on straw with that hood drawn tight, only your nose poking into the cold air. Your body becomes a tent, your cloak the canvas. And if you were lucky enough to share fur blankets, the warmth felt decadent, even if the edges crawled with lice. Consider also how these clothes affected sleep. Heavy wool doesn't breathe well. You grow damp, itchy, and overheated in some places, while your feet remain icy in others. You toss and turn, adjusting layers constantly. But when temperatures plummeted, comfort was irrelevant. You endured. There's a kind of camaraderie in this, too. You look around the hall and see soldiers bundled identically, each wrapped like a rolled carpet. Rank might decide who had thicker cloaks, but everyone shared the same silhouette, woolen lumps huddled in shadow. In such moments, identity blurred. You weren't knight or peasant, you were just another body trying not to freeze. And if you listen closely, you'll hear the small sounds of warmth maintenance, men muttering curses at twisted hose, someone yanking a cloak tighter, the squeak of fur against stone. These little noises are the lullaby of medieval barracks, as familiar as the crackle of fire. So as you pull your own blanket closer tonight, remember that warmth in the Middle Ages wasn't central heating or fluffy duvets. It was scratchy wool, smelly fur, and the sheer determination to outlast the night. And somehow, against all odds, they managed. You've wrapped yourself in wool and fur, pulled a hood tight, and still the cold creeps in. That's when the simplest, most primal strategy takes over. Bodies press together, trading warmth like currency. Shared heat is more reliable than any cloak. And in a medieval castle, packed with soldiers on campaign, privacy wasn't even a word. A mainstream historical fact. Medieval garrisons often slept in communal halls or barracks, shoulder to shoulder, sometimes 2 or 3 men to a single rough bunk. There were no tidy rows of single beds. Instead, planks, straw pallets, or just floor space was divided as efficiently as possible. If that meant men tangled like spoons in a drawer, so be it. The body heat generated in these tight clusters could raise the temperature noticeably in a closed hall. You picture yourself sliding onto a straw pallet already half occupied. A stranger grunts, shifts, and makes space. Another body flops down on your other side. Within minutes, your shoulders and legs press against them, and you feel the subtle warmth radiating through layers of cloth. It's uncomfortable in daylight, but at midnight it feels like the difference between life and frostbite. Here's a quirky tidbit. Medieval chroniclers sometimes joked about companion warmth, even noting that soldiers or monks would thank their sleeping partners in the morning. It wasn't romance, just physics. One man alone could freeze, but 3 bundled together might live to fight another day. There are even references to men singing or telling jokes before collapsing in a huddle, as though to make the awkwardness more bearable. And yet, historians argue about the cultural tolerance for such closeness. Was it universally accepted, or were some soldiers deeply uncomfortable with it? Evidence suggests variation. Monastic communities embraced communal sleeping as discipline, while mercenary companies sometimes treated it as humiliating. Some records hint at teasing and rough humor about bedmates, while others treat it as mundane necessity. Scholars still debate how soldiers themselves felt resentful, resigned, or simply too tired to care. Now imagine the sensory overload of this arrangement. You lie squashed between 2 men, their cloaks overlapping yours, their breath warm on your ear, their snores rattling like saws. The smell is overpowering. Sweat, wool, smoke, damp boots shoved under pallets. Your skin itches, your ribs complain, but beneath it all, your core temperature steadies. You aren't shivering anymore. You're surviving. Of course, this human central heating came with trade-offs. Lice spread eagerly from one scalp to the next. Fleas hopped like tiny soldiers of their own, and colds became communal events. You might wake with someone's elbow in your ribs or their hair in your mouth. But would you rather risk pestilence or freeze in lonely honor? For most men, the choice was easy. There's a strange intimacy here too. In the darkness, differences of rank blur. A lord might sleep in his own chamber, but knights on campaign, stripped of luxury, huddled like anyone else. You sense bonds forming in that closeness brotherhood forged not only in battle, but in the quiet misery of shared sleep. And there's the sound of it. Dozens of men breathing in unison, their collective heat turning a frozen hall into a muggy cave. You shift on the straw, realize your body has stopped shaking, and let the warmth lull you, even as someone's snore rattles inches from your ear. So the secret of the medieval night wasn't courage, nor fancy blankets, but cooperation. Men became each other's furnaces, their bodies stitched together in silent agreement. Better to stink, itch, and elbow each other than die of the cold. And as you tuck into your own bed tonight, maybe with a partner or pet nearby, you're echoing an ancient truth. Warmth has always been communal. The medieval soldier knew it all too well, and so he slept, wrapped not just in cloth, but in the furnace of human company. You stir awake in that crowded hall, pressed between warm bodies, straw prickling your cheek, when suddenly you notice something odd in the shadows. Shapes loom in the corners, but they aren't pillars or furniture. You blink, rub your eyes, and realize you're looking at tents, actual canvas tents pitched inside the castle walls. At first it feels absurd, like someone dragged a campsite into the middle of a stone fortress. But then the logic clicks. A tent inside a hall was a fortress within a fortress. And, more importantly, warmth within warmth. A mainstream historical fact. Soldiers and nobles alike sometimes erected smaller tents or wooden, framed canopies inside larger halls during campaigns. Called pavilions or cabinets, these structures acted as private chambers. They weren't waterproofing shelters against rain, because the castle itself already provided that. Instead, they were insulation tricks, meant to trap body heat in a smaller pocket of space. If you've ever hidden under a blanket as a child and felt the difference instantly, you understand why these medieval men pitched tents beneath a roof. Picture yourself stepping inside one of these indoor tents. The outside hall is a cavern, cold drafts sliding between torches, but once you duck under canvas, the air stills. Heat from bodies lingers. Straw crunches underfoot. Cloaks hang from pegs, and a little clay lamp flickers, filling the space with a warmth that feels almost luxurious. This is no longer just survival, it's a cocoon, a chamber where you might for a moment forget the stone fortress outside. Here's a quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have found records of nobles dragging entire beds into such tents. Four-poster frames, mattresses stuffed with feathers, quilts layered thick all under canvas pitched in the great hall. Imagine the absurdity. A stone castle meant to repel invaders, and inside, a little mock bedroom complete with curtains and cushions, like a dollhouse set up in a refrigerator. For the common soldier, tents were simpler, just oiled cloth stretched across poles, maybe a blanket thrown over the top, but even those created microclimates worth their weight in gold. And here's where scholarly disagreements surface. Some historians argue that the use of indoor tents was limited to the elite, pointing to detailed illustrations of royal pavilions or noble chambers. Others suggest that smaller, makeshift enclosures may have been widespread among ordinary soldiers, especially during long sieges. The debate hinges on fragmentary evidence, chronicles describing rows of pavilions inside halls, could mean noble displays, or they could mean common improvisation. The ambiguity leaves modern scholars shrugging, but the practice clearly existed in some form. Now, imagine how it felt. You crawl under the flap, and suddenly you're not one of 50 men snoring in a cavernous echo chamber. You're one of 3 or 4, huddled in your own micro-shelter. The canvas muffles sounds, dampens drafts, and turns body heat into something almost cozy. You hear muffled laughter from a neighboring tent, the faint hiss of a lamp wick, and the creak of someone adjusting on a straw pallet. For the first time all week, your toes stop aching. The sensory details pile up. Inside the tent it smells of wool, oil, and straw sharper, more intimate than the general hall. The air feels warmer, slightly humid, like breath recycled among friends. The canvas walls billow faintly as drafts slip past. But compared to the icy corridors outside, this is paradise. Even the flicker of lamplight bouncing off canvas feels soothing, softer than naked torchlight against stone. Of course, there were trade-offs. Fires couldn't be lit inside tents for fear of suffocation or sudden disaster. The heat here was purely human body warmth, cloaks, and the insulation of fabric. And yet, that was enough. In a cold climate where stone magnified misery, a simple cloth barrier made nights bearable. You can imagine the hierarchy too. A noble's tent gleamed with embroidered cloth, maybe crimson or blue, and had servants standing watch. Meanwhile, common soldiers patched scraps of canvas with wax, creating lopsided cones of cloth. But both tents, silk pavilion or ragged shelter, served the same psychological purpose. They shrank the world. They told a weary body, "Here you are not lost in the endless cold. Here you are enclosed, shielded, almost home." One can't ignore the psychological warmth of privacy. Sleeping in an open hall meant every cough, snore, and curse was your lullaby. But under canvas, you at least felt unseen. You might whisper to a bunkmate, mutter prayers, or simply let your eyes close without 50 men watching. That sense of enclosure, however fragile, softened the brutal reality of castle nights. And you know what? Some men even decorated their tents. Chronicles mention painted canvas with heraldic patterns, banners pinned at the entrance, or charms and religious icons hung from ropes inside. Imagine the glow of a little Madonna icon flickering above your straw pallet, a saint's face reflecting lamplight as you drift into uneasy dreams. In a world of harsh stone and harsher winters, these touches were more than vanity. They were psychological insulation, comfort woven into canvas. Think of the sounds now. Outside, the draft whistles, boots clomp on stone, and men bark orders. Inside, it's quieter, padded. Someone mutters, someone else snores softly, and you hear the faint rustle of straw as a bunkmate shifts. Your own heartbeat sounds louder in this close space. For once, you're not thinking of frostbite, you're simply thinking of sleep. There's one more layer of irony here. Castles were supposed to be impregnable homes, yet the very men defending them often recreated the simplicity of a campsite indoors. It's as if stone fortresses never gave the warmth humans truly needed, so soldiers carried the memory of campfires and canvas into the very heart of medieval strongholds. So when you picture medieval soldiers sleeping, don't just imagine cloaks on straw. Imagine tents pitched in drafty halls, canvas glowing from lamplight, men curled like children beneath makeshift roofs. Imagine nobles lounging in velvet-draped pavilions, while their men nearby huddled in patched lean-tos, different in luxury, the same in need, both hiding from the cold, not with stone but with cloth. And as you drift in your own bed tonight, maybe under a duvet or quilt, smile at the thought that you too are living inside your own little tent. 4 walls, fabric wrapped around you, heat trapped in. The same principle medieval soldiers clung to. Warmth within warmth, shelter within shelter. A lesson that still whispers through the centuries every time you crawl under the covers. You push aside the flap of canvas and step back into the drafty hall. The air instantly stings your cheeks again, and you draw your cloak tighter. That small cocoon of a tent made you forget how hostile the larger space is. But survival in medieval castles wasn't only about fabrics and straw, it was also about what you put in your belly. Tonight, you notice men clustered around jugs and mugs, their faces flushed not from firelight, but from ale. Warm beer bellies, in their own way, served as heating systems. A mainstream historical fact, ale was the staple drink of medieval Europe, consumed daily by soldiers, peasants, and nobles alike. Water was often unsafe, and wine was too expensive for common men, so ale weak by modern standards became the drink of choice. And it wasn't just for hydration. In winter, the slight alcohol content dilated blood vessels, creating a short-lived sense of warmth. Soldiers felt a buzz in their cheeks, a flush in their chest, and mistook it for insulation. You pick up a wooden mug, sniff, and taste the thick, yeasty liquid. It isn't the crisp lager of today, but a warm, cloudy brew that clings to your tongue like liquid bread. After 2 gulps, your head grows light, and your shoulders relax. You lean back against the wall, eyes half closing, and suddenly the hall feels less brutal. Ale was comfort in a cup, part placebo, part survival trick. Here's a quirky tidbit. Soldiers sometimes heated their ale before drinking, almost like a medieval version of mulled wine. Spices like cloves, cinnamon, or ginger might be added if supplies permitted. Imagine sipping a steaming mug, the scent of cinnamon rising, the liquid sliding down warm into your belly. For a brief moment, it was as if winter itself had been swallowed and tamed. And yes, sometimes onions or herbs were tossed in as well, because why not, if it kept you alive through the night? But scholars argue whether ale truly helped soldiers withstand the cold, or whether it merely made them careless. Physiologically, alcohol lowers core body temperature, even as it tricks you into feeling warmer. Some historians argue that reliance on ale actually worsened survival chances, while others insist it was a practical morale booster, keeping men relaxed enough to rest in conditions otherwise unbearable. What's certain is that the men believed in it, and belief itself can be as strong as any cloak. Picture the hall now, Jugs are passed hand to hand, mugs clink against teeth, men chuckle at jokes that barely make sense. A group hums a song, their voices weaving drunkenly into harmony. The cold hasn't vanished, but it feels less sharp, blunted by laughter and ale. You imagine lying down with a belly full of this liquid bread, warmth spreading through your limbs, and drifting into a heavy, dream-laden sleep. Of course, it wasn't always pleasant. Overindulgence meant soldiers stumbled to their pallets reeking of sour ale, snoring louder than a trumpet, or vomiting in the rushes. The smell would linger for days, mixing with the ever-present straw and sweat. But even then, ale was too ingrained in medieval life to vanish from nightly routines. Better to deal with a drunken bunkmate than face the night stone-cold sober. Think, too, about the communal aspect. Drinking was bonding. You weren't just warming your belly, you were warming your spirit with camaraderie. Sharing ale before bed was like weaving a net of fellowship, ensuring that when the cold pressed hardest, you didn't feel quite so alone. And in that sense, ale was as much psychological insulation as physical. The sensory picture deepens. You hear mugs clattering on wooden tables, men belching without shame, bursts of laughter echoing off stone. You smell yeast, smoke, and sweat all tangled together. You taste the heaviness of ale coating your mouth, leaving a sticky film on your teeth. You feel your eyelids heavy, your body limp, sliding slowly into unconsciousness. This was medieval anesthesia, the simplest way to trick your brain into ignoring frostbitten toes and a frozen nose. But not everyone approved. Religious leaders often warned that ale made men slothful, vulnerable to sin, or unfit for night watches. Chroniclers complain about guards falling asleep on duty, blaming their mugs rather than the bone-deep exhaustion of garrison life. The tension between necessity and vice followed ale through the centuries, yet the men themselves rarely cared. Their priorities were simple: warmth, laughter, and a few hours of oblivion. Imagine yourself now, wrapped in your cloak, belly heavy with warm ale. Around you, men murmur, chuckle, and groan, slowly collapsing into straw heaps. The torches dim, the hall quiets, and snores replace conversation. The cold hasn't vanished, but the edge has dulled, and for once you're not counting every shiver you're too drowsy to care. There's a strange comfort in this image. Yes, ale wasn't perfect. Yes, it may have fooled more than it fixed. But it offered what soldiers needed most: the illusion of warmth, long enough to fall asleep, and sometimes illusion was enough. So as you sip whatever you have at your bedside, maybe tea, maybe cocoa, remember the medieval soldier with his clay mug of cloudy ale. He wasn't savouring flavour or quality. He was savouring survival, one gulp at a time. The hall grows quieter now, the drunken laughter fading into snores. You shift under your cloak, still half awake, and notice that not everyone is huddled in the middle of the great space. Some men have slipped into doorways, corners, and even the stables, drawn toward one very practical source of warmth: animals and ovens. Suddenly you realize that in a castle, the warmest spots weren't always near the noble hearth, but in the places where heat was generated without intention: kitchens, cloisters, and stables. A mainstream historical fact: kitchens in medieval castles were massive, often separate stone chambers with huge ovens and fires burning nearly all day to feed hundreds of mouths. These fires weren't allowed to die, which meant the kitchen stayed warmer than almost anywhere else in the fortress. Servants, cooks, and sometimes even low-ranking soldiers sought excuses to linger nearby at night, because the ambient heat seeped into the walls. And the stables? Horses, cows, and other beasts gave off so much body heat that in winter, stable air could feel downright toasty compared to the icy corridors. Picture yourself sneaking through a narrow passageway, following the faint glow of embers. You slip into the kitchen, and the difference hits immediately. The air smells of bread crusts, meat fat, and wood smoke. Warmth clings to your face, radiating from the banked coals in the oven. You imagine stretching out in a corner, wrapping your cloak tight, drifting into sleep with the scent of fresh bread in your nose. Of course, the cook might boot you out in the morning, But for now you'd almost swear you're in paradise. Now for a quirky tidbit. There are accounts of soldiers sleeping in cloisters near monasteries or castle chapels, not for holiness, but for warmth. Why? Because candles and lamps burned late into the night, and the smaller stone chambers trapped their heat more effectively than the cavernous hall. Imagine bedding down beneath painted saints, letting their serene gazes bless your dreams, while secretly you were just enjoying the relative coziness of a side room warmed by wax. And yet, scholars still argue about how often soldiers actually shared space with animals. Some insist that men preferred to avoid stables, except in dire need, because the smell of manure and the risk of fleas outweighed the benefits. Others argue that in brutal winters, practicality trumped disgust, and soldiers cheerfully curled up beside horses, pigs, or even dogs for shared body heat. Evidence from peasant homes of the period shows that humans and animals commonly cohabited in winter. Why should castles have been different? The debate remains unresolved, hanging in the smoky air of history. But let's explore the sensory side. Imagine lying in straw beside a great draught horse. Its body radiates heat like a furnace, its breath steaming into the dark. You hear the slow, rhythmic crunch of it chewing hay, the occasional soft whicker as it dreams. Your own body relaxes as that warmth seeps into your bones. True, the smell is pungent, the straw damp, and fleas nip at your ankles, but for the first time tonight, your teeth stop chattering. Kitchens carried their own symphony. Even at night, ovens creaked, embers popped, and rats skittered across the stone chasing crumbs. You lie in the corner, eyes half shut, listening to the heartbeat of a castle through its kitchen. There's comfort in that hum. Warmth without drunken snoring, heat without body odor. The only danger is the temptation of food smells, roasting meat and spiced stews clinging to the air while your stomach growls. There's also hierarchy at play. Nobles claimed the choicest chambers, of course, with tapestries and feather beds. Servants slept where work placed them. Scullions curled up by the ovens. Grooms collapsed in stalls beside their horses. Soldiers squeezed in wherever space was left, but warmth was always the deciding factor. Rank gave you options, but desperation made you inventive. Think of the psychological aspect again. To sleep in the stable was to admit vulnerability. You were lowering yourself to the level of beasts. And yet, men did it gladly, because the alternative was a cold hall where breath turned to frost. You can almost imagine the relief in the morning, stretching awake, patting the horse's flank in gratitude, and trudging off to drills with a faint smell of hay clinging to your cloak. Another overlooked source of warmth was the bakery. Castle bakeries, with their huge bread ovens, generated heat that radiated long after baking ended. Sleeping near them meant you could wake to the scent of rising loaves. You picture rolling over, half asleep, to hear a baker clattering trays, and maybe sneaking a warm crust when nobody was looking. Warmth, food, and shelter, all in one spot. It doesn't get better than that in the Middle Ages. The debates continue, of course. Some scholars wonder if these warm spots were too valuable to be cluttered with sleeping bodies. Kitchens were busy, stables smelly, and bakeries dangerous with hot ovens. Maybe soldiers weren't allowed in them at all. But archaeology gives us little hints: charred straw near ovens, discarded gaming pieces in stables, suggesting that men did indeed slip into these forbidden corners. Whether sanctioned or secret, survival always found a way. So the image of medieval sleep broadens. Not just halls with rushes, not just cloaks in tents, but hidden corners where ovens glowed, horses steamed, and bread baked. Each soldier learned quickly where the warmest cracks of the castle could be found, and claimed them like treasure. Close your eyes now and smell it. The smoky sweetness of bread crust, the sharp musk of animals, the oily tang of kitchen fires. Hear the sounds: horses shifting, ovens popping, distant murmurs of men. Feel the warmth, uneven, imperfect, but enough to keep your heart steady through the long night. And as you nestle into your own bed tonight, maybe with central heating humming quietly, think of the medieval soldier curling in a stable, cheek pressed to straw, grateful for the breath of a horse. Warmth was never guaranteed. It was stolen wherever it could be found. You wake again, stiff from the straw, still tasting the yeast of ale in your mouth and the acrid tang of smoke in your nose. The hall has quieted, though now and again you hear a soldier cough or a horse stamp its hoof in the nearby stable. You shift, trying to find a warmer patch, and your hand brushes against a small clay pot. At first, you think it's just for the obvious waste. But then you realize that chamber pots, strange as it sounds, sometimes pulled double duty as heaters. A mainstream historical fact. Ceramic and metal vessels were common in medieval households, and people quickly discovered that once filled with hot water or embers, they radiated heat for hours. Bed warmers, in other words, were not a modern invention. Wealthier households had brass or copper warming pans with lids, carried to beds and slid between sheets. Soldiers, lacking such luxury, used what they had: pots, jugs, or even thick-walled bowls heated near the fire. In desperate winters, almost anything that held warmth for a few minutes became precious. Imagine this. A soldier fills a clay chamber pot with steaming water drawn from a cauldron. He clutches it to his chest as he crawls onto straw. The ceramic radiates gentle heat. His cloak traps it, and for a short while, he feels something close to bliss. Yes, it's absurd to think of cuddling an object designed for much less romantic purposes, but warmth erases pride. Survival always bends the rules of dignity. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some records, people stuffed heated stones or even roasted vegetables, turnips, onions into cloth pouches to act as improvised hot water bottles. Imagine curling around a steaming turnip, clutching it like a treasure. Soldiers laughed about it, sure, but they didn't let the laughter stop them. After all, a roasted root might save your toes from frostbite. And yet historians argue over just how widespread this practice was among common soldiers. Brass warming pans were documented in aristocratic homes. Yes, but did rank-and-file troops really have the luxury of heating stones or boiling water just for sleep? Some scholars say yes, pointing out how soldiers always maintained fires for cooking and could easily repurpose the embers. Others argue that the time and resources were too scarce, especially in siege conditions. It remains uncertain whether heated pots and stones were routine or rare, but the ingenuity is undeniable. Picture yourself lying in the hall now. The draft seeps in from arrow slits, your cloak barely thick enough, your body pressed close to two snoring bunkmates. But beneath your cloak, clutched tight, is a warm pot. The ceramic edge radiates against your stomach. The heat leaks slowly, fading, but long enough for you to drift into sleep. You close your eyes, sighing at the luxury, ignoring the oddity that you're hugging something meant for entirely different purposes. There's also the sensory experience to savor. Clay warmed by fire has a particular smell, earthy, sharp, tinged with smoke. Your hands ache slightly from the heat as you first clutch it, then slowly relax as the pot cools. You hear the faint gurgle of water sloshing, the hiss if it spills onto straw, the muttered curses of a man burned by his own improvised heater. These sounds and smells become part of the nightly landscape of survival. And then, of course, there were mishaps. A heated stone too hot could singe a cloak or burn skin. A careless soldier might crack a pot by pouring boiling water into it too quickly. There are even tales of embers spilling and setting straw alight, creating sudden midnight chaos as men leapt up, stomping flames. The very tools of warmth could betray you. Sleep in medieval castles always balanced between relief and disaster. But imagine the psychology of it. Hugging a warm object was comfort as much as practicality. It reminded you of hearth and home, of your mother's kitchen fire or the family oven. Even in a drafty barrack, that little glow of warmth gave you the illusion of domestic safety. It's no wonder men clung to whatever radiated heat, even if it meant sharing a bed with a pot. And don't forget the hierarchy here. Nobles had ornate bedwarmers, polished brass pans with long handles. They'd be carried by servants into feather beds, leaving lords drowsy in perfumed comfort. Common soldiers, meanwhile, improvised with pots, stones, or food items. The contrast is stark, yet the principle was the same. Steal warmth wherever you can, no matter how ridiculous it looks. You can almost hear the jokes echoing through the hall. Careful, or he'll marry that turnip. Don't spill your chamber pot, mate. We're all lying in the same straw. Laughter softened the absurdity. But in the end, every man envied the one who had heat pressed against his chest. As you lie in your own bed tonight, perhaps with a hot water bottle or electric blanket, you're practicing the same ritual, wrapping yourself around a source of heat, letting it lull you into sleep. The medieval soldier, hugging a warm pot in the shadows of a stone fortress, was not so different. He wanted what you want, the comfort of warmth, the illusion of safety, the luxury of a dream. So picture him now, wrapped in his scratchy cloak, surrounded by snores, cheek pressed to straw, and arms clasped tightly around a warm clay vessel. Ridiculous, yes, but also human, deeply human. And somehow, through these little inventions, he survived another freezing night in a world that offered no mercy. You wake again in the cold grey hush before dawn, and this time your teeth are chattering in rhythm with the groans of the castle walls. All through the night you've fought drafts, those invisible intruders that slithered in through cracks, arrow slits, and window frames. Even when you clutched a warm pot or burrowed in straw, the wind found you. It always found you. So how did medieval soldiers keep their fortresses from feeling like giant stone wind tunnels? The answer lay in plugging the gaps with whatever was at hand. Windows stuffed with cloth, wood, or even moss. A mainstream historical fact. Most medieval castles did not have glass windows, at least not for common soldiers. Nobles in later centuries might afford small glazed panes, but garrisons relied on wooden shutters, cloth hangings, or simple boards fitted across arrow slits and windows. These weren't airtight. Drafts still crept through, and in winter, snow could even sift inside. To combat this, soldiers stuffed rags, straw, or old cloaks into gaps, creating crude insulation. Think of it as medieval caulking, messy, smelly, but vital. Picture yourself kneeling at a narrow window slit, icy wind stabbing your cheeks. You stuff a wad of cloth into the opening, pressing it with numb fingers until the gusts dull to a faint whistle. The difference is immediate. No, it doesn't make the room warm, but it makes the cold less vicious, less alive. Your cloak feels heavier on your shoulders, and you dare to hope for a few hours of rest without constant shivering. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, people smeared animal fat or clay into cracks in walls and shutters. Imagine living in a chamber lined with greasy smears, the walls glistening faintly in torchlight. It wasn't pretty, but it kept the wind out. Even moss or dung found use as insulation, pressed into crevices until the room smelled like pasture but at least didn't feel like the Arctic. Medieval survival had no dignity, only pragmatism. And here's where historians disagree. Some argue that castles, with their enormous stone walls, weren't actually as drafty as popular imagination suggests. They believe the sheer thickness of masonry buffered much of the wind. Others point to chronicles describing tapestries rippling on walls and fires struggling to stay lit indoors, suggesting that drafts were a constant enemy. Perhaps both are true, some chambers well fitted, others leaky as barns, depending on craftsmanship and maintenance. The debate leaves modern scholars divided. Now, imagine what it was like to sleep in one of these draft-fighting rooms. Soldiers draped woolen cloths over doorways, hung spare cloaks across window slits, even piled straw along the bottom edges to block the chill. You crawl under your cloak, hear the wind battering outside, but notice that it doesn't claw at you quite as much as before. The cloth muffles the sound, the straw dulls the sting. It isn't warm, not really, but it is survivable. Consider also the role of tapestries and hangings. Nobles hung heavy woven cloth across walls, not only for decoration, but also as insulation. Soldiers, lacking such luxury, sometimes scavenged old banners, patched sails, or rough wool blankets to hang around their bunks. You picture yourself inside one of these makeshift cubicles, fabric fluttering faintly, enclosing you like a tiny den. The psychological comfort was as valuable as the physical barrier, but not all attempts were so elegant. Think of the sensory details. Straw stuffed into cracks, rustling in the night, cloths stiff with frost by morning, animal dung crusting and flaking along stone. The smell is earthy, sour, unglamorous, but the air is noticeably less sharp. You take a deep breath and almost smile. It isn't comfort in the modern sense. It's comfort in the survival sense, where every degree of warmth feels like a gift. Of course, drafts were more than just chilly. They carried danger. A wind tunnel through the hall could snuff torches, scatter embers, and make fires unpredictable. Soldiers cursed not only the cold, but also the constant hassle of relighting flames, protecting sparks, and shielding their food from sudden gusts. Blocking drafts was as much about safety as warmth. Imagine now the hall at night. Dozens of windows and arrow slits have been stuffed with rags, cloaks, or straw. The walls look ragged, patched, almost comical. Soldiers huddle in corners, their silhouettes framed by flapping cloth. You hear mutters, see hands pressing fabric tighter as the wind grows, and realize that everyone in the room has become a makeshift carpenter, plugging holes against nature itself. And yet, despite the absurdity, it worked. Not perfectly, never perfectly, but enough. A degree or two of warmth meant life. Soldiers fell asleep under patched cloth walls, listening to the wind muffled instead of shrieking. In the darkness, that small mercy felt enormous. There's a kind of universality here. Even today, people stuff towels under drafty doors, tape plastic across windows, or hang thick curtains to trap heat. You've probably done it yourself. Maybe in an old apartment with rattling frames. That instinct connects you directly to the medieval soldier, crouched with numb fingers, shoving straw into cracks in a fortress wall. So as you curl up tonight, insulated by walls, windows, and heating systems you barely notice, spare a thought for the garrison soldier who fought drafts with scraps and dung. He didn't conquer the cold, but he dulled its claws just enough to drift into dreams, and perhaps that was victory enough. You've stuffed the window cracks, layered your cloak, maybe even hugged a warm stone or pot, but still, true rest remains elusive. Why? Because soldiers in medieval castles rarely slept a full night through. Instead, they lived by rotations, their nights chopped into shifts, their rest stolen in fragments rather than granted in long stretches. Guard duty, watchtowers, and the constant threat of attack meant that sleep was never guaranteed and never uninterrupted. A mainstream historical fact: medieval armies organized their nights into watches. The night was divided into several segments, each a few hours long, and different groups of men were assigned to guard while others slept. This meant you might close your eyes for 2 or 3 hours, only to be shaken awake for your turn on the battlements. It wasn't laziness if you dozed in your cloak during the day-night duty had already stolen your rest. Picture yourself bundled on straw, half dreaming, when a rough hand jolts your shoulder. Your watch, someone growls, and you drag yourself upright, pulling on stiff boots, cloak heavy with damp. You stumble through a torch-lit corridor to the tower stairs, climb into the cutting wind, and suddenly you're staring out over dark woods or white snowfields. Your body protests, still yearning for sleep, but your eyes strain against the blackness for any sign of movement. That was medieval rest, never deep, always provisional. Here's a quirky tidbit. Some castles used water clocks, sand timers, or even the tolling of bells to divide shifts. But in smaller garrisons, it was cruder. A guard simply woke his replacement when he felt done. Imagine the resulting chaos: one man waking you after an hour, another letting you sleep 5. The night stretched unpredictably. Sleep fractured into uneven fragments. And here comes the debate among historians. Some argue that this fractured sleep mirrored what scholars now call segmented sleep, a natural rhythm humans once followed before artificial lighting. In this theory, people in the pre-modern world often slept in 2 phases. First sleep, and second sleep, with a period of wakefulness between. Perhaps medieval soldiers, with their rotations, weren't suffering so much as following an older human pattern. Others counter that garrison duty was harsher, that interruptions from danger and duty shattered the body's natural rhythm rather than supporting it. The question lingers, unresolved. Were soldiers exhausted victims of interrupted sleep, or simply participating in a broader medieval norm? The sensory details are vivid. Imagine trudging to the wall at midnight, boots crunching frost, torch sputtering. The air cuts like knives, your breath bursts into white clouds, and your hands numb on a spear shaft. Below, the dark is thick, occasionally broken by a wolf's howl. Inside, your comrades lie sprawled in cloaks, their snores echoing faintly. You envy them fiercely, yet you know your turn will come soon enough to lie down again if you survive your watch without freezing. And even when you return, sleep never comes easily. Your body is tense from wind, your ears still straining for sounds of attack. You curl up again in straw, cheek pressed to another man's shoulder, but your mind remains half awake. Every creak of the castle, every gust of wind through the cracks, sounds like footsteps. You learn to sleep lightly, like a cat never truly surrendered, always ready to be shaken awake. Imagine how this fractured rhythm shaped life. Men snored at noon, napped at odd hours, dozed leaning against walls or sitting by fires. Sleep was not a nightly gift, but a daily scavenger hunt, pieced together in fragments whenever the opportunity allowed. You never felt fully rested, but you survived. That was the point. The psychological toll was immense. Think of the irritability, the brawls sparked by fatigue, the mistakes on the battlefield caused by sluggish minds. And yet, camaraderie formed in those night watches too. Two men leaning on a parapet, shivering together, whispering jokes or swapping stories, forged bonds as strong as any battle could. The night watch was misery, but it was shared misery. There's also the smell, the sound, the taste of it. Picture chewing on a hunk of cold bread at 3 in the morning, trying to stay awake. Picture breathing through a scarf stiff with frost, ears stinging as you listen for distant hoofbeats. Picture stumbling back to the hall, collapsing on straw, falling instantly into a shallow doze while your cloak still reeks of smoke and sweat. This was the texture of medieval soldiering, not only battles, but nights carved into ragged slices of wakefulness and exhaustion. Even in moments of rest, you could never shake the paranoia. At any second, the bell might toll, horns might sound, enemies might appear at the walls, and so you never sank fully into dream. You floated on the surface of sleep, drifting but never diving, always braced to wake. Think of that the next time you grumble about being woken by a text message or a noisy neighbor. The medieval soldier would have traded anything for 6 unbroken hours under a warm duvet. Instead, he slept in fragments, always bargaining with the night, always losing a little of himself to the cold and the duty. So as you close your eyes tonight, grateful for the luxury of uninterrupted rest, remember the garrison soldier curled in straw, pulled awake by duty, stumbling to the tower in the black frost. His life was measured in rotations, his rest in scraps, and somehow, against the relentless cold and endless interruptions, he endured. You rub your eyes after another short and broken stretch of rest. The straw is scratchy, your cloak damp, your limbs heavy from being shaken awake for watch duty. But now you notice something else as you roll over. Not everyone around you is equally miserable. Some men have thicker blankets, others sleep nearer the fire, and 1 or 2 even lie on raised pallets instead of the stone floor. In a medieval castle, warmth at night was never divided equally. It followed rank, wealth, and privilege. The hierarchy of comfort was as visible in sleep as it was in daylight. A mainstream historical fact, medieval castles were built with layered spaces. Lords, ladies, and high-ranking knights often had private chambers with fireplaces, wooden floors, and wall hangings. Lower-ranking soldiers bunked in draughty halls, cellars, or towers, with little more than straw and cloaks. This was not accidental. Architecture itself reflected social rank. Even in sleep, hierarchy dictated who shivered and who didn't. Picture yourself walking through the castle at night. You pass the great hall where soldiers lie huddled in groups, cloaks wrapped tight, breath fogging in the air. Then you climb a staircase to the Lord's chamber. Here, a fire still glows in the hearth. Tapestries cover the walls, muting the drafts. A thick mattress of feathers rests on a wooden frame, draped with furs from fox, marten, or bear. A servant curls in the corner, ready to tend the fire. The difference is shocking: two different worlds, separated by a single floor of stone. Here's a quirky tidbit. Records mention that nobles sometimes shared beds not because they lacked space, but because a feather mattress was considered too precious to waste on just one body. Lords might invite guests or favoured knights to share, not only for warmth but as a gesture of trust and intimacy. Imagine being a young squire, trembling with nerves but secretly grateful for the chance to sink into furs instead of straw. And yet, historians argue about how much better off the nobility really were. Yes, they had fireplaces and furs, but stone walls are merciless even in private chambers, and fires smoked more than they warmed. Some scholars suggest that while nobles slept more comfortably, they were still far colder than modern people imagine. Others counter that luxury imports, silk quilts, feather beds, and heavy tapestries truly made a significant difference. The truth likely lies between. Nobles still felt the cold, but their discomfort was softened by layers of privilege. Imagine the sensory differences. Down in the barracks, the air reeks of sweat, straw, and smoke. Snores echo, rats rustle, and the draught gnaws at your bones. Up in the Lord's chamber, the air smells of beeswax candles, resinous logs, and perfumed oils. The fire pops gently, the furs feel heavy and soft, and silence reigns except for the occasional crackle of the hearth. Which room would you rather fall asleep in? The hierarchy answers for you. But soldiers weren't entirely without hierarchy of their own. Even in the great hall, placement mattered. Veterans or favoured men slept nearer the fire. New recruits, servants or prisoners, found themselves shivering at the edges. If you were lucky, you had a blanket issued by the garrison stores. If not, your cloak became your only bedding. And if you lost even that, you huddled against another body or froze. This created tension, of course. Imagine men bickering over who got the warmest spots, fights breaking out over blankets, or jealousy simmering as one soldier received a fur-lined cloak while another got a threadbare rag. Warmth was status. To sleep warmly meant not just comfort but importance. And yet, even the privileged weren't immune. Fires went out, furs grew damp, tapestries froze against stone walls. Imagine a nobleman cursing as he rose to find frost creeping across the inside of his chamber, his fancy bed still cold at its edges. Privilege didn't erase the medieval climate, it only blunted it. There's also the psychological weight of hierarchy. To lie freezing in the hall, hearing rumours of featherbeds upstairs must have stung. Soldiers might grumble in the dark, "Why should my lord sleep on goose feathers while my toes rot on straw?" Yet loyalty often demanded silence. The hierarchy of sleep mirrored the hierarchy of power, and both were accepted as natural order. The sensory experience is worth lingering on. Picture yourself shifting on straw, body aching, listening to the creak of footsteps above. You imagine the Lord's chamber glowing warmly while you blow into your numb hands. The inequality presses down harder than the cold. But then you hear someone laugh, someone share a joke in the dark, and you realize camaraderie is its own kind of blanket. What nobles had in luxury, soldiers sometimes replaced with solidarity. Still, hierarchy shaped everything. Who had the thicker cloak? Who got the warmer corner? Who owned the only fur blanket? All of it determined by rank. Survival was never equal. Even in dreams, privilege held sway. So as you settle into your own bed tonight, think about how effortless warmth feels for you, how blankets and heating come without thought of rank. For the medieval soldier, comfort was always a ladder, with nobles perched at the top, cloaked in furs, and ordinary men clustered below, clinging to straw. And yet, somehow, they all slept, each in their appointed place, proving that even in the coldest castles, human beings adjust to whatever order they are given. You roll over on the straw, half asleep, and the fire in the great hall has long since burned to low embers. The nobles upstairs are surely wrapped in featherbeds and furs, but down here the soldiers clutch at whatever coverings they can. Not everyone had access to silks or velvet, or even wool of good quality. For the rank and file, their cloaks and rough blankets were more than clothing, they were their only protection against the bitter draughts. One firmly recorded detail is that cloaks were multi-purpose tools in the Middle Ages. A soldier's cloak served as raincoat by day, blanket by night, and if things went badly in battle, it could even double as a shroud. These garments were thick wool, often heavy, and rarely cleaned. They smelled of smoke, sweat, and weather, but in a freezing castle hall they were worth more than coin. You draw your own cloak tighter, feel its rough texture scraping your neck, and realize why soldiers refuse to part with them. In fact, some armies fined men for losing or selling their cloaks, knowing how quickly the cold could kill. The garrison's cloak was, in every sense, a lifeline. You might be amused to know that soldiers sometimes slept with their cloaks still fastened at the neck, as if they couldn't risk wasting time adjusting them. Wrapped tightly, they looked more like rolled carpets than men. In the morning, they would rise still bundled, rubbing eyes through folds of wool, cloaks stiff with frost along the edges. There's still no consensus about just how effective these cloaks were. Some researchers insist they offered genuine warmth, thanks to the insulating power of lanolin-rich wool. Others believe that while useful, cloaks alone were insufficient for long winter sieges, and that men often froze despite them. The truth probably lies in between. A cloak might keep you alive, but not comfortable. Picture the hall. Dozens of men lie in rows, each wrapped in a rough wool blanket or cloak. The colours are muted browns, greys, and dull greens, faded by weather and patched with crude stitching. The air smells of wool and smoke, of bodies pressed together. Someone shifts, cloak rustling like dry leaves. Someone else coughs, pulls fabric tighter around his head. The hall looks less like a military garrison and more like a field of cocoons. The sensory experience isn't luxurious. Cloaks are scratchy, stiff, and often damp. You lie curled, your knees pressed against your chest, your breath trapped inside the folds, warming your nose slightly but making your face clammy. Your body sweats in patches while your toes remain frozen. But at least you aren't bare. At least you have something. And when soldiers lacked even cloaks, then they scavenged. Old canvas, animal hides, even sacks used to carry grain could become coverings. Some men layered everything they owned, turning themselves into walking bundles of rags. It wasn't about appearance, it was about survival. There's a psychological side too. Cloaks were familiar, personal. They carried the smell of home, of past battles, of nights by the fire. To sleep without one felt naked, exposed, even dishonorable. Soldiers sometimes named their cloaks, treating them almost like companions. In a world where comfort was rare, even fabric took on the role of friend. Oddly enough, a few chronicles describe soldiers using their cloaks to cover not only themselves but also their weapons. Imagine lying on the straw with your sword hidden under wool, keeping the steel warm and rust-free. You're not just sleeping under a cloak, you're protecting your very means of survival. The inequality remained clear, of course. A knight might have a cloak lined with fur, dyed deep colours, embroidered with trim. A foot soldier's was plain, coarse, and worn thin. Yet in the dark of the hall, wrapped tightly against the cold, the difference mattered little. Both were shivering men trying to survive until dawn. Think now about the sound of it. Dozens of men adjusting cloaks, the shuffle of wool on straw, the muffled sighs as they huddled deeper. Think about the smell. Lanolin, damp wool, and the faint odour of sheep that never quite washed out. Think about the feeling. A weight pressing on your chest, scratchy against your skin, but keeping the deadly chill at bay. It's not glamorous, it's not cozy, But for medieval soldiers, these rough cloaks were blankets, shelters, and armor against the night. They weren't dreaming of feather beds, they were simply grateful not to freeze. So as you pull your own soft blanket over yourself tonight, remember the soldier curled in a fortress hall, wrapped tight in a cloak stiff with frost. His blanket was scratchy, heavy, and smelled of smoke, but it meant the difference between life and death. Comfort was relative, but survival was absolute. The hall smells of wool and smoke, but your ears catch another sound, the faint scrape of hides dragged across the floor. You blink through the gloom and see soldiers spreading animal skins, thick pelts of deer, wolf, or sheep against the walls and over their bedding. If cloaks were the common man's blanket, then animal skins were insulation in its rawest form. What's well documented in medieval inventories is the use of hides not only as clothing but also as bedding and wall hangings. In castles across Europe, fur and leather were layered across drafty stone surfaces to reduce the icy bite of winter. For elite households, pelts were trophies, bear skins, fox furs, or ermine displayed as symbols of status. For ordinary soldiers, they were simply practical barriers between flesh and stone. You might be surprised to learn that hides often served double or triple duty. A sheepskin could line a saddle by day, then become a soldier's blanket at night, and eventually be cut into patches for repairing boots. Nothing went to waste. A hide might carry sweat, smoke, and manure, but its warmth was priceless in the black chill of a castle night. Researchers remain divided over just how widespread fur bedding was among common soldiers. Some argue that hides were too valuable, reserved for nobles or wealthy knights. Others point to archaeological finds of coarse sheepskins in garrison contexts, suggesting ordinary men did indeed curl up beneath them. The evidence points to a patchwork reality. Some garrisons slept with nothing but straw, while others padded their walls and floors with animal skins scavenged from hunts or tithes. Close your eyes and imagine it. You lie down on a patchwork of furs, the hair prickly but warmer than bare stone. Your cheek sinks into coarse wool, your body pressed against the lingering scent of animal musk. The room feels smaller, closer, almost cave-like, as hides drape over walls and flutter faintly in the draught. It's not comfort in the modern sense, it's survival through the borrowed warmth of beasts. The sensory detail is overwhelming. The air is thick with the mingled smells of smoke, sweat, and animal grease. Your hands brush fur stiff with dried sweat, or greasy with old fat rubbed in as a crude preservative. Yet against the cold you don't mind. The hides trap heat in a way straw never could. Wrapped tightly, you fall asleep imagining the living creature that once owned the skin, its body as warm as you now wish to be. Oddly enough, some chronicles mention that hides were hung not just for warmth, but for acoustics. Large tapestries or pelts softened the echo of a stone hall, muting the constant clang of armor and voices. Imagine drifting into sleep not only warmer but also cocooned in muffled silence, the roar of the hall dulled to a hum, a small mercy, but a mercy all the same. The risks were real, though. Hides were breeding grounds for pests. Fleas thrived in fur, lice hid in seams, and the smell of rancid fat clung permanently to cloaks and bedding. A careless soldier might wake scratching until his skin bled. Yet when the choice was between itching and freezing, most chose the itch. Consider, too, the inequality of skins. Nobles wrapped themselves in furs of fox or marten, lined their chambers with ermine, or draped bear pelts across their beds. Soldiers used whatever was available: sheep, goat, even dog or cat. The hierarchy of warmth was carved into the very fabric of animal hides. The nobler the beast, the softer the sleep. Still, hides carried a primal reassurance. They reconnected men to the wild, to the animals that shared their world. In a stone castle that felt alien and hostile, a fur pelt reminded you of hearths, huts, and the natural order. Curling up inside an animal skin, you weren't just warming your body, you were borrowing the survival strategies of the beasts themselves. Picture now the hall at night. Hides spread across straw, draped along walls, tucked over sleeping men. A soldier snores with a wolf pelt over his head, Another lies curled on sheepskin, his boots sticking out. The hall resembles less a barracks and more a hunter's camp. The line between man and beast blurs in the flicker of torchlight. And when dawn comes, you rise with the stink of fur on your cloak, the imprint of wool still pressed into your cheek. You scratch at bites, stretch aching limbs, and roll up the pelt for another night. It isn't glamorous. It isn't clean, but it kept you alive, and that's all the cold castle demanded. So as you lie beneath your own modern blanket, imagine the medieval soldier burrowed in hides, cocooned in the warmth of animals long gone. Rough, itchy, and foul-smelling though it was, that skin carried him through another night. Comfort was never the point, survival was. The hides keep you alive through the night, but when you stir awake the next morning, your nose wrinkles at a sharp tang in the air. It isn't just smoke from the dying hearth, or sweat from the men packed around you. It's something saltier, smokier, more pungent. Then you realize the very food that kept you fed also changed the air you breathed, and by extension the smell of where you slept. Salt, smoke, and salted smoke lingered not only in the kitchens but in the bedding, cloaks, and very skin of the garrison. One firmly attested reality is that food preservation shaped the castle's atmosphere. Meat and fish were heavily salted to last through winter, stored in barrels that lined storerooms and sometimes the very halls where men slept. Fires used for smoking meat also smoked out sleeping soldiers. Your bedding absorbed it, your cloak carried it, and your hair reeked of it. In some castles, the great hall doubled as a dining room, dormitory, and food store, meaning that soldiers quite literally bedded down beside barrels of brine-soaked pork. You might smile at the thought that the smell of dinner clung to you through the night, but it wasn't always pleasant. Salted meat sweated brine, and barrels leaked onto the straw. Imagine rolling over in your sleep and finding your sleeve damp with sticky salt water. Not exactly luxury. Here's an odd little practice noted in some accounts. Dried herbs like sage or thyme were hung above storage and sometimes strewn into rushes to counteract the odor. Soldiers joked that they were sleeping in a stew pot, surrounded by meat, salt, and herbs all at once. The line between bedroom and kitchen blurred until it vanished entirely. Modern historians remain divided on how overpowering these smells really were. Some argue that medieval people, accustomed to such environments, barely noticed. Others insist that the reek of salted and smoked foods was suffocating in closed halls, especially in winter when ventilation was limited. Whichever version is truer, the fact remains. The sense of preservation were part of the nightly landscape. Picture yourself lying on straw, pulling your cloak over your nose. The air is thick, your throat dry from smoke, your lips cracking from salt. You breathe shallowly, trying not to gag on the stench of half-cured pork mingling with damp wool. Then your stomach growls, betraying you, and you realize the same smell is both disgusting and comforting. Disgusting because it clings to your skin, comforting because it promises food tomorrow. The sensory details build. Fires in the kitchens below waft smoke through the cracks, and it mixes with sweat from men, manure from animals, and the omnipresent tang of salt barrels. You taste it even as you close your eyes, sharp, metallic, lingering on your tongue like seawater. Your cloak smells like bacon, your hair like a smokehouse. To sleep in a medieval castle was to marinate overnight. Of course, these odors carried risks. Excess smoke irritated lungs, leading to chronic coughs, or what later centuries called black lung. Salt preserved meat but also parched soldiers, making them thirstier than fresh food would. The very methods of survival pressed on bodies like an unseen weight. You might live through winter, but you did so at the cost of comfort. And yet, there was something strangely reassuring in it. The smell of smoke meant fire, and fire meant warmth. The smell of salt meant meat, and meat meant another day of strength for watch duty. Soldiers grew accustomed to the olfactory assault, even attached to it. To lie in a hall without these scents might have felt uncanny, even unsafe. Think, too, of the hierarchy again. Nobles dined on fresher foods, with cooks striving to mask preservation with spices, but soldiers lived cheek by jowl with barrels of salted fish. If you were unlucky, you might bed down beside pickled herring and wake smelling like the sea. If you were luckier, you might sleep near a smoked venison, the scent at least richer, less offensive. Either way, the air of the castle never let you forget your stomach. You can almost hear the jokes, men teasing each other for smelling like bacon, or pretending they were sausages hanging in a smokehouse. Laughter softened the discomfort, as it always did, but the truth was unavoidable. The castle at night was as much pantry as dormitory. Imagine drifting into half-sleep with that combination. Smoke scratching your throat, salt drying your lips, meat scents wafting into your dreams. You don't dream of roses or fresh air. You dream of stews, of hearth fires, of fields where food grows. Even sleep itself becomes seasoned with salt. And when morning comes, you stretch, yawn, and rub your eyes, only to find your hair stiff with smoke and your cloak crusted with salt stains. You groan, but you also know you survived the night, and you'll survive the next one, because the same food and smoke that poisoned your nose also kept your body alive. So as you slip under your own clean covers tonight, think of the medieval soldier lying beside barrels of salted pork, his dreams flavored by the food he'll eat tomorrow. For him, the smell of preservation was the smell of survival, not pleasant, but essential. The scent of salted meat lingers in your nose, but it's not hunger that keeps you awake now. It's tension. Even if you're warm enough in your cloak, even if the draught has been stuffed with rags, even if you've had your fill of ale, there's a deeper current running through the castle nights. Unease. You roll onto your side, eyes half open, because in a fortress there's always the whisper of danger. The night watch paranoia seeps into your bones, leaving you half asleep, half ready for alarm. One point made clearly in chronicles is that garrisons rarely slept deeply. Castles were built for defense, which meant soldiers always expected attack, whether from rival lords, raiding bands, or even betrayal from within. Watchtowers rang bells at the faintest movement. Horns blared at suspicious shadows. A soldier's bed was never more than a temporary station. You didn't rest so much as collapse, ears still straining for the next order to rise. Imagine yourself curled on straw when a sound cracks the silence, the snap of wood, a dog barking, footsteps on stone. You jolt upright, cloak tangled, heart hammering. A moment later you realize it's just another soldier stumbling to relieve himself in the courtyard. But by then, your pulse has already banished sleep. This cycle repeats night after night until your nerves fray thin. A curious little glimpse comes from accounts of sieges, where men sometimes slept in full armor or with weapons at hand, unwilling to risk being caught vulnerable. Even padded gambesons served as makeshift bedding, thick enough to keep the cold away but heavy to wear through the night. It wasn't comfortable, but it gave soldiers the illusion of readiness. Better to wake sore than wake dead. Scholars are divided on whether this constant vigilance improved survival or wrecked morale. Some argue that men adapted, learning to rest in shallow cycles, conserving energy while remaining alert. Others insist that the lack of true rest eroded discipline, leaving garrisons irritable, clumsy, and prone to mistakes. Modern sleep science would agree with the latter, but medieval life rarely cared for health beyond survival. Now, put yourself there fully. You lie in a hall where dozens of men twitch in their sleep, groaning or muttering, each dream fractured by tension. The draught whistles faintly, but louder than that is the echo of boots above, guards pacing the walls. Every thud is a reminder that someone is awake because enemies might be near. You burrow into your cloak, but your ears keep flicking toward the sound. Sleep becomes a negotiation. Your body demands it, your mind resists. Even when you finally doze, dreams twist with paranoia. You imagine doors crashing open, torches flaring, horns blasting. You wake in a sweat, cloak damp, heart racing. And then, unable to tell dream from reality, you listen again, straining at the silence until exhaustion finally drags you under once more. This fear wasn't just practical, it was cultural. Chronicles often emphasize the vigilance of good soldiers, condemning those who overslept as weak or dishonorable. To be caught asleep on duty was one of the greatest shames a man could bear. Stories circulated of men punished brutally, even executed, for failing to keep watch. No wonder sleep was shallow. Even in dreams, shame stalked them. Oddly enough, some garrisons adopted rituals to soften the anxiety. Before bed, men might say short prayers, sing low hymns, or murmur protective charms. These weren't purely religious, they were psychological armor, words meant to wrap around them like blankets. To whisper a psalm before sleep was to imagine an angel watching the gate while you closed your eyes. The sensory picture sharpens. Picture lying down, straw rustling under you, the air thick with smoke and sweat. In the distance, dogs bark at shadows, owls hoot from the forest, and the wind rattles shutters. Every sound feels charged, suspicious. The snores of your comrades become both comfort and irritation. Comfort because they mean you aren't alone. Irritation because you can't join them fully. Your hand never strays far from your knife. Your ears never fully close. Psychologically, it shaped the rhythm of garrison life. Men grew used to fragmented sleep, long naps during the day, or catnaps stolen near a fire. They laughed off their fatigue, but in truth, they lived in constant readiness. Even the warmth of cloaks and hides couldn't erase the colder reality. Castles weren't places of safety so much as places of vigilance. And when the alarm really did sound, chaos erupted. Imagine horns blasting at midnight, men leaping from their pallets, scrambling for weapons in the dark, tripping over cloaks, shouting in confusion. In that moment, you understood why no one dared sleep deeply. Better to be restless than dead. So, as you lie tonight in your secure, silent room, think of the soldier in his stone fortress, half dreaming, half listening, body curled in straw but mind pacing the battlements. For him, rest was always conditional, always haunted by the chance of sudden danger. In the cold halls of a medieval castle, paranoia itself was a bedfellow, as close as any cloak or fur. You rub your eyes, still groggy from half-sleep haunted by horns and phantom footsteps. The night watch is over, but the chill has not relented. Someone beside you groans, pulling his cloak tighter, and mutters about how no army in its right mind should be out in weather like this. And he's not wrong. The truth is, winter campaigns were often avoided whenever possible, because the struggle wasn't only against enemies, it was against the cold itself. What's well attested in records of medieval warfare is that armies frequently went into winter quarters. Campaigning slowed or stopped altogether from late autumn through early spring. Roads became impassable mud or icy death traps. Rivers froze, supplies dwindled, and men risked frostbite long before battle could begin. If an army had to move in winter, it was usually for a desperate reason: defense against invasion, or the rare chance to surprise an enemy unprepared. Picture yourself trudging through snow in boots stiff with ice, cloaks stiff with frost, your breath burning your lungs. You've marched all day, and when evening comes, you're expected to sleep in a frozen camp or a half-ruined castle with no fuel for fire. You envy the garrisons who stayed put, at least able to lean on stone walls and a hearth, however smoky. Out in the field, even straw was a luxury. You might be amused to know that chroniclers sometimes describe commanders deliberately calling off sieges as winter drew near. Not because they lacked men or courage, but because everyone knew the cold would finish the job faster than swords. Let the enemy freeze in their own walls. Why waste lives and fuel keeping your own army upright? But researchers disagree about how universal this winter pause really was. Some argue that northern European armies, hardened to cold, could and did keep moving when needed. Others believe that medieval winters were simply too brutal for large-scale campaigning, pointing to gaps in battle records during harsh seasons. The so-called Little Ice Age in later centuries only worsened the problem. In the end, the evidence suggests flexibility. Some armies endured winter marches, but most avoided them like plague. Now imagine what it meant for sleep. In winter campaigns, soldiers often had no castles at all, just tents pitched on frozen ground, or lean-tos scraped together from branches and canvas. Men lay side by side, teeth chattering, pressed so close that frost formed on their beards where their breath condensed. Fires were difficult to keep alive in wet snow, and damp wood smoked more than it burned. Sleep was less recovery than suspended animation, bodies conserving energy like hibernating animals. Inside castles, the story wasn't much brighter. Supply lines in winter often snapped, leaving garrisons short on firewood. Fires dwindled, and soldiers wrapped themselves in every scrap of fabric they owned. Some castles even rationed straw, forcing men to share pallets or sleep on bare stone. You curl in your cloak, listening to the groans of men who know tomorrow will be colder still. The sensory details are stark. The hall is dark, only a few coals glowing faintly. The air bites your nostrils with every breath. Your fingers stiffen even inside your cloak, and your toes feel like lumps of stone. Around you, men cough, sneeze, and curse. Someone mutters a prayer for spring. The atmosphere is heavy with despair, heavier than the weight of wool on your shoulders. Oddly enough, chronicles record cases of soldiers deliberately keeping themselves awake, rather than risk freezing in sleep. They stamped their feet, sang songs, or told stories to ward off drowsiness, fearing that if they surrendered fully, they would never wake again. Imagine the eerie sound of men humming through the night, voices quavering, torches flickering, as if the hall itself were holding vigil against death. And yet, camaraderie was forged in these grim seasons. Men joked bitterly about their misery, invented songs mocking the cold, or gambled away scraps of food to pass the time. The laughter was thin, but it kept spirits alive. Even in the coldest castles, humour was a kind of fire. There's also the question of strategy. A lord who forced his men to march in deep winter risked rebellion or desertion. Soldiers who froze at night were less willing to fight at dawn. So leaders weighed not only supply lines and enemy strength, but also the raw question: could their men even sleep? Could they rest enough to function? The answer often dictated the rhythm of entire wars. Picture now the dawn after a freezing night. Soldiers rise stiff, groaning, joints cracking, cloaks crusted with frost crackle as they shift. Breath clouds hang in the hall like fog. Fires are coaxed from embers, and the smell of smoke returns, filling lungs with both relief and irritation. The men are alive, but barely. That was victory enough. So while we might imagine armies always clashing dramatically in snow, the reality was often quieter, slower, more desperate. Winter was not the season of glory, it was the season of survival. Sleep itself became a form of resistance, a stubborn clinging to life in a world that seemed determined to freeze it out. As you pull your own blanket tonight, maybe warm and soft, think of the medieval soldier dreading another night in a stone hall, or worse, in a snowy camp. He didn't dream of conquest, he dreamed of spring, and sometimes, simply making it through winter was the greatest triumph of all. The nights stretched long and bleak, yet not every soldier endured them in quite the same way. As you stir under your cloak, you notice something peculiar in the Lord's chambers above. While most of the garrison huddled in rough wool or hides, a select few enjoyed imported luxuries, comforts carried along trade routes from faraway lands. Silk quilts, feather mattresses, linen sheets, and cushions filled with down drifted into castles, creating a stark divide between how the many and the few slept. Evidence from household accounts reveals that wealthy nobles often commissioned beds stuffed with goose or swan feathers. Merchants ferried fine linens from Flanders, silks from the East, and exotic furs from Russia or Scandinavia. These weren't everyday items for common soldiers. They were treasures. A bed layered with imported textiles was as much a statement of power as a golden chalice or jeweled sword. To sleep in such comfort, wrapped in silks and feather quilts, was to announce that you had wealth enough to buy warmth itself. Imagine slipping beneath a quilt stitched from damask silk, its sheen catching the glow of the firelight. Your head rests on a pillow filled with down, softer than anything a soldier in the hall could imagine. The air smells faintly of beeswax candles instead of smoke. Outside, wind gnaws at the shutters, but inside you float in a nest of fabric. The contrast is so sharp you could almost forget the cold exists at all. There's even a curious note in some chronicles. Feather beds were sometimes thought too luxurious, softening warriors and making them weak. Hard straw was believed to keep men tougher, closer to the earth, while feathers bred laziness. Yet the same critics often owned feather beds themselves. Hypocrisy, after all, is older than castles. Scholars remain divided on just how widespread these comforts became by the later Middle Ages. Some argue that only the highest nobility had access to true feather mattresses or imported silks. Others point to wills and inventories of middling knights that mention a bed of down or one quilt of feathers, suggesting the practice trickled downward. The debate lingers, but one thing is clear. Soldiers in the barracks could only dream of such indulgence. Picture yourself back in the Great Hall. You lie on scratchy wool, cheek against straw that rustles with every shift. You cough at the smoke scratching your throat, shiver at the draught brushing your toes. Now imagine the chamber above, where your commander reclines under quilts dyed scarlet, perfumed with herbs, fur draped across the footboard. The contrast gnaws at you, as bitter as the cold itself. The sensory details sharpen the divide. In the noble's room, the fire glows steadily in a private hearth. Tapestries muffle the wind, their woven patterns glowing with candlelight. The bedding feels smooth against the skin, warm without being stifling. In the soldier's hall below, your cloak scratches, your feet ache with chill, and the straw shifts with fleas. The difference is not merely physical, it's psychological. One man sleeps dreaming of tournaments, the other prays only for dawn. You might be amused to know that imported quilts were sometimes embroidered with protective charms or family crests. To sleep under one was not only to stay warm but also to sleep wrapped in identity and status. Soldiers had no such talismans, save perhaps a worn cross carved from wood or a strip of cloth from home. For the common man, warmth came not from prestige, but from proximity, lying pressed to another body, huddling beside a horse, or clutching a warmed pot. Think of the envy this created. Soldiers muttered in the dark, comparing their misery with what they imagined happening upstairs. Some probably fantasized about storming their lord's chamber just for a taste of his bed. Yet hierarchy was ironclad, and those who tried to grumble too loudly risked punishment. Warmth was not evenly shared, it was rationed by rank. And still, even in the noble's chamber, warmth had limits. Fires sputtered, tapestries froze at the edges, quilts grew damp with condensation, glass windows were rare, shutters leaked. So while nobles enjoyed relative comfort, they too woke to cold noses and stiff fingers. Privilege softened the misery, but it could not banish it. The psychological comfort, however, was immense. To sink into down rather than straw, to wrap in silk rather than a flea-ridden cloak, that difference buoyed the spirit, even if the air remained frigid. A noble might wake stiff, but he woke believing himself protected by wealth, while a soldier woke believing the world had no mercy for him at all. Picture the hall again that night. Soldiers roll over in straw, cloaks pulled high, teeth chattering. Above, a noble shifts under quilts, sighs in half-sleep, and perhaps dreams more easily. Both will rise tomorrow to face the same cold dawn, but one will do so groggy and aching, the other somewhat rested, and that margin might decide who commands and who obeys. So as you lie in your own bed tonight, with soft sheets and a pillow that cradles your head, you're closer to the medieval noble than the soldier. The feather mattress, the quilt, the layered warmth, all luxuries once reserved for the few, are now common for you. Remember that as you close your eyes, you're living the dream of countless medieval soldiers who slept in straw, staring at the ceiling, wishing for a quilt that never came. You roll over on the straw, tugging your rough cloak tighter, and your nose brushes against something warm. For once, it isn't another soldier's elbow or the heat of a horse nearby. It's a stone flat, smooth and faintly radiating warmth through the night air. Someone has slipped a heated brick beneath the bedding, or tucked a roasted turnip inside a cloth pouch. Strange though it seems, this was one of the more inventive tricks soldiers and servants used to survive long, freezing nights in castles. Contemporary accounts and household manuals make clear that hot objects were a trusted comfort in medieval Europe. Stones and bricks were placed near a fire until they soaked up heat, then carefully wrapped in cloth to prevent burns. These makeshift bed warmers glowed faintly against the skin for an hour or two before cooling. Wealthier homes used polished metal warming pans filled with hot coals and slid between sheets, but soldiers in drafty halls made do with whatever material could hold warmth. Imagine kneeling by the hearth, pulling a brick from the coals with iron tongs, its surface hissing faintly as embers fall away. You wrap it quickly in a rag, tucking it under your cloak. When you finally settle onto straw, the heat radiates upward into your bones, as though you've stolen a piece of the fire itself. It's not permanent by dawn. The stone will be cold as the walls, but for a little while, you drift towards sleep without shivering. There's even a whimsical note in some chronicles: roasted root vegetables pressed into service as personal heaters. Turnips, onions and parsnips, once baked, held surprising warmth. Wrapped in cloth, they were slipped into beds like edible hot water bottles. By morning, the soldier had both a cooled but still edible snack and a slightly warmer night. Ridiculous, perhaps, but practical. Historians are divided over how common these practices were among rank-and-file troops. Some argue that heating stones and roots was a luxury of castles with plentiful fuel and organized kitchens. Others point to simple archaeological evidence: cracked stones in hearths, charred remains of root vegetables that suggest such improvisations were widespread. What's certain is that ingenuity never slept, even when the soldiers tried to. Close your eyes and imagine clutching a warm stone to your chest. At first it's almost too hot, your palms prickling, but then it evens out, glowing like a secret ember under your cloak. Around you, men mutter and shuffle, some hugging similar bundles, others cursing as their stones crack or their cloths catch a spark. A faint smell of scorched wool hovers in the air. In the half-dark, these little tricks feel like miracles. The sensory scene is vivid. You feel the weight of the brick pressing into your ribs, radiating heat in uneven pulses. The smell of roasted root vegetables drifts nearby, savory and earthy, mixing with the smoke and sweat of the hall. You hear men chuckle softly at their own inventions, one teasing another for cuddling an onion. The humor is part of the warmth, too. Laughter, like heat, spreads quickly. Of course, the risks were real. A stone heated too long could scorch fabric or blister skin. Warming pans filled with coals sometimes sparked fires, turning bedding into tinder. Chronicles tell of occasional disasters where a careless bedwarmer set straw alight, forcing entire halls to stamp out flames in the dark. Survival always balanced on a knife edge, comfort bought at the risk of calamity. And yet, despite the dangers, these methods endured for centuries. They weren't luxuries, they were acts of defiance against the cold. To roast a vegetable not for eating but for heating was to laugh at winter itself. To slip a hot stone under your cloak was to claim a piece of the fire as your own. For soldiers who had little else, these small victories mattered. The psychology of warmth shines here too. Hugging a hot brick or turnip gave not only physical relief but also a sense of control. So much in a soldier's life was dictated by orders, rank, and weather. But here was something you could do yourself. Something simple that made the night bearable. Even a lowly foot soldier could warm his own bones, at least for an hour. Picture the hall at night. Dozens of men curled around lumps under their cloaks. To an outsider, it might look absurd, grown warriors cuddling vegetables and stones. But in the flickering light, you see their shoulders relax, their shivers ease. You hear fewer coughs, fewer groans. In the brutal theatre of medieval survival, absurdity was often genius. By dawn, the stones are cold, the vegetables shriveled. A soldier bites into the cooled turnip, chewing breakfast with a grin. Another tosses his cracked brick aside, already planning to heat it again tonight. The cycle repeats, night after night, as winter drags on. Small comforts, endlessly improvised, keeping men alive where sheer will was not enough. So as you pull a hot water bottle or electric blanket close tonight, think of the soldier curled in a hall centuries ago, clutching a hot stone wrapped in rags, or an onion still steaming from the hearth. Strange companions, yes, but in that icy fortress, they were guardians of sleep, little talismans of warmth in a world of endless cold. The stone in your arms cools as dawn creeps in. You roll it away, only to smear ash across your fingers. The smoke that kept you alive last night still lingers in the hall. It curls from the dying hearth, drifts down the chimney, and clings to your cloak. You cough, eyes watering, as you realize another truth about medieval castle nights. Warmth came at a cost, and that cost was soot, ash, and smoke that settled on everything, even your skin. Written accounts from castle households confirm that open hearths and primitive chimneys filled interiors with grime. Unlike modern fireplaces, medieval smoke rarely vented cleanly. Flues were narrow, poorly drafted, or non-existent. The result was a constant haze indoors. Soldiers sleeping near the fire felt its warmth but woke coated in soot, their faces blackened like coal miners. Fires that were meant to sustain life also left behind a residue of discomfort. Picture yourself lying on straw by the hearth. The coals glow faintly, the heat welcome, but your lungs sting with every breath. Your eyes smart, tears slipping down your cheeks. By morning your cloak is streaked grey, your hair smells of smoke, and your skin feels greasy from soot. You rub your cheek, and your hand comes away dark. Still, you smile grimly. Better a blackened face than a frozen corpse. Oddly enough, some people believed soot itself had protective qualities. Folk remedies claimed that rubbing ash on the body kept away fleas or even strengthened the skin against cold. Imagine soldiers joking as they smeared soot across their cheeks, pretending to be warriors painted for battle. Practical or not, such rituals softened the misery of sleeping in smoke. Modern scholars continue to debate how harmful this constant exposure was. Some argue that short-term smoke inhalation merely caused irritation, while others point to chronic respiratory issues described in medical texts: coughs, inflamed lungs, shortened breath that sound eerily familiar to modern descriptions of long-term smoke damage. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains suggest high rates of respiratory illness in populations living around open fires. Whatever the medical verdict, the discomfort was real and immediate. Now, imagine the sensory landscape of the hall. Smoke curls low, glowing faintly in the firelight, like grey ribbons weaving between men. Ash drifts down like snowflakes onto straw. Every movement kicks up a puff of soot. Every breath tastes of burnt oak. The torches on the walls sputter, their flames suffocated by draughts. You hear coughs echoing in the dark, wheezing breaths of men who will never again know what clean air feels like. Yet for all this misery, soldiers often preferred the smoky corner near the hearth to the icy corners by the door. The warmth outweighed the sting. Some even jostled for space, arguing over who had earned the right to sleep closest to the embers. Rank decided much of it, but sometimes raw stubbornness did. A man might rather choke on soot than freeze on stone. And soot spread beyond the hearth. It crept up walls, blackened ceilings, stained tapestries, and left a greasy film on every surface. Even in noble chambers, painted walls turned grey, and carved stonework darkened. Castles were not the pristine white fortresses you might picture, but dim, smoke-stained labyrinths. To live in them was to carry smoke in your lungs, your hair, your bedding. There's a curious note in some accounts. People deliberately mixed ash with water to scrub floors, or with animal fat to create crude soap, so the same grime that coated soldiers became part of the cleaning process. Imagine lying down on straw knowing tomorrow you'll rub the same ash into the rushes as a disinfectant. Life in castles blurred the lines between filth and function. And soot wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be dangerous. Chimneys clogged easily, leading to smoke filling entire halls. Fires sometimes smouldered unseen in soot-lined flues, breaking out in sudden blazes. A garrison that thought itself safe from the cold might suddenly find itself scrambling to put out flames at midnight. Safety was never absolute, not even from the very fires meant to protect. Still, soot became part of the identity of castle life. Soldiers joked about their black beards painted on by smoke. Children in noble households played at tracing shapes into ash on the hearthstones. Everyone lived with it because there was no choice. Survival in the cold meant breathing smoke, wearing soot, and carrying its mark into every dream. Close your eyes and imagine sleeping there tonight, your cheek pressed to straw that smells faintly of char, your hair crusted with ash, your lungs sore from breathing smoke for hours. Yet your body, for once, is not shivering uncontrollably. You wake dirty, but alive. And that was always the trade: warmth bought with grime, survival traded for breath. So as you curl under your own clean blanket in a house with filters and vents, think of the soldier waking blackened in a stone hall, soot smeared across his face like war paint. For him, the mark of survival was not softness or comfort. It was the grey smear of ash, proof that he had endured another night against the cold. The soot clings to your cloak, but you've learned to accept it. What you cannot ignore are the sounds of the hall. Even when the fire has burned down and the drafts have been blocked, the night is never silent. As you lie half asleep on straw, the soundscape of sleep surrounds you, an orchestra of snoring, coughing, armor rattling, dogs barking, and the distant cry of wolves in the forest beyond the walls. Silence in a medieval castle was rare. Chroniclers often describe the cacophony of communal living. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of men crammed into halls or barracks, each bringing his own habits and ailments. One soldier snores like a trumpet, another coughs from smoke-damaged lungs, a third mutters prayers in his sleep. Horses in the stable stamp and whinny, dogs scavenge for scraps and bark at shadows, while owls hoot from the battlements. It was a symphony of discomfort, woven so tightly into garrison life that men barely noticed after a while. Imagine lying there, eyes shut, straw scratching your cheek. To your left, a man snores so loudly you feel the vibrations through the floor. To your right, another groans and shifts, his armor clanking as he rolls over. Somewhere in the distance, boots creak on the parapet above guards pacing endlessly. And beneath it all, the faint, unnerving chorus of wolves howling, reminding you that even outside the walls, danger never sleeps. One curious detail comes from monastic dormitories, which weren't so different from soldiers' quarters. Monks wrote of the constant chorus of coughs, sneezes, and murmured dreams in their communal halls. It's amusing to think that whether you wore armor or robes, sleep in the Middle Ages was always accompanied by the same soundtrack of humanity. Archaeologists and historians still puzzle over whether soldiers grew used to this noise or if it kept them perpetually restless. Some argue that people of the past, accustomed to communal living from childhood, found it easier to tune out others' sounds. Others believe the constant racket wore down morale and health, making deep sleep almost impossible. The truth may have varied from person to person, one soldier deaf to snores, another ready to throttle his bunkmate after a single night. The sensory experience goes deeper. Imagine the smell that accompanied the noise: sweat sour in the straw, smoke clinging to wool, and the sharp tang of urine from chamber pots not emptied until morning. Sound and smell mingled to create an environment where comfort was nearly impossible, and yet your body, exhausted from drills and guard duty, surrendered to sleep anyway. Sometimes, the noise was punctuated by sudden alarms. A dog's bark turned frantic, the watchman's horn blared, and men lurched awake, straw flying, swords scraping from scabbards. Hearts pounded until the all-clear came, revealing it was only a fox in the courtyard or the wind rattling a shutter. Afterward, soldiers muttered curses, wrapped themselves again, and tried to fall back asleep more restless than before. You might be surprised to know that some garrisons deliberately encouraged low-level noise at night. Whispered conversation, humming, or even soft singing kept men awake enough to prevent freezing. In silence, the temptation to drift into dangerous torpor grew too strong. But with the constant hum of voices and sounds, soldiers remained alert, if never fully rested. Picture the hall in full detail. Shadows flicker from dying torches. Men breathe in uneven rhythms. One whimpers in a dream. A rat scurries along the wall, chased by a dog that growls low before curling back down. Outside, the wind howls like a living thing. Inside, the echo of armor shifting and boots clattering on stone never truly ceases. You close your eyes, trying to sink deeper, but the castle itself seems alive, groaning and sighing, its very stones cracking under frost. The psychological toll of constant noise was real. Soldiers joked about their comrades' snores, but beneath the humor lay exhaustion. In a world without earplugs or soundproofing, you couldn't shut out your environment. You shared every cough, every groan, every bark. Sleep was a collective act, not an individual retreat. And yet there was comfort in it too. To hear the breathing of others reminded you that you weren't alone. To wake at night and see dozens of silhouettes rising and falling in rhythm with your own chest gave reassurance. The noise, irritating though it was also proof of life, of companionship, of survival. The worst nights were the quietest when sickness thinned the hall, or when men had marched out and not returned. So as you tuck into your silent room tonight, insulated from neighbors by walls and windows, think of the medieval soldier lying in a hall alive with sound. He didn't drift off to peaceful silence, but to the chorus of his fellow men, the creaks of armor, the coughs of smoke-filled lungs, and the haunting cries of wolves outside. For him, this racket was the lullaby of survival. The racket of snores, coughs, and rattling armor fades a little as the night deepens, but as you lie there, you notice a different sound rising softly through the gloom. It isn't laughter or groaning. It's voices, low and steady, blending together like waves. Soldiers and servants, some on the edge of despair, begin to pray or chant. In the bitter cold, when cloaks and fires weren't enough, men turned to words, music, and ritual. Prayer and chanting filled the gaps that straw and hides could not. Contemporary chronicles describe soldiers whispering psalms before sleep, not just out of faith but as a kind of rhythm to calm the body. Monks attached to garrisons often led nightly prayers, their voices carrying through the draughty halls. Even men who barely understood Latin found comfort in the sound of words recited together, syllables rolling like a steady drumbeat. It gave order to chaos, warmth to fear. Imagine yourself lying on straw, cloak over your head, as a dozen voices hum the same verse nearby. The words blur into vibrations, low and soothing. Your shivers ease, not because the air is warmer, but because your mind feels shielded, wrapped in something larger than yourself. The ritual doesn't banish the cold, it reframes it. If suffering is holy, if endurance is blessed, then perhaps you can endure just a little longer. You might be intrigued to know that songs weren't always solemn. Some soldiers sang bawdy ballads or marching tunes at night, their laughter softening the sting of freezing air. Others hummed lullabies remembered from home, quiet reminders of mothers and hearths long left behind. The sound of a lullaby drifting in a hall of warriors is almost absurd, yet profoundly human. It turned stone into something like a cradle, if only for a moment. Historians remain divided on whether prayer truly offered physical benefit or if it was purely spiritual comfort. Some argue that group chanting, with its steady breathing, may have generated a kind of meditative calm that lowered stress, even slowed heartbeats, conserving energy in cold. Others insist the effect was symbolic faith and fellowship, not physiology, kept men alive. The truth may rest somewhere in between. Prayer warmed the spirit if not the body, and sometimes that was enough. The sensory scene sharpens. A hall once filled with hacking coughs now hums with low chants. The torches flicker, shadows sway on the walls, and voices rise and fall together. You feel the vibration in the straw, in your chest, as though the castle itself is humming with you. Even the draught seems muted, subdued by the rhythm. For a few minutes the garrison forgets its misery. Sometimes, these rituals went beyond words. Soldiers carried small relics, crosses, beads, charms, and clutched them as they slept. Some whispered incantations, half Christian, half folk tradition, to ward off frostbite or nightmares. Imagine a man rubbing his wooden cross until the grain polished smooth, mumbling prayers for warmth. Another traces a sigil into ash on his cloak, convinced it will shield him. Faith and superstition blended seamlessly, because in the cold, anything that offered hope was welcome. Oddly enough, some lords encouraged this nightly rhythm. Commanders knew morale was fragile, and the collective sound of voices praying together was as valuable as firewood. A garrison that prayed together, believed together, endured together. To snuff out despair was as important as snuffing out drafts. But prayer also revealed division. Not every soldier belonged to the same faith, especially in mercenary companies where men came from across Europe. Some muttered foreign prayers, others scoffed at ritual altogether. Whispered disagreements occasionally broke into arguments. Yet even so, the very act of arguing filled the night with sound, a reminder that men were alive and present. Picture yourself drifting off as voices hum around you. A psalm ends, silence stretches, then someone begins a new verse, half sung, half muttered. Another joins in, then another. The hall breathes together, sound layering over sound. Outside, wolves howl. Inside, men answer with song. It isn't beautiful in the musical sense, but in the human sense, it is magnificent. The psychological warmth of prayer cannot be overstated. To believe that you weren't alone, that saints, angels, or ancestors stood beside you transformed fear into endurance. Soldiers wrapped themselves in faith as tightly as they wrapped themselves in cloaks. The body might freeze, but the soul was insulated. And in the end, that may have been the greatest survival tool of all. Not stone walls, not furs, not fires, but the collective voice of men refusing to yield to silence. For in silence, despair grows. In sound, in shared ritual, the night passes more gently. So as you lie in your quiet bed tonight, remember the medieval soldier half frozen on straw, listening to murmured psalms and whispered charms. His warmth wasn't just fire, it was fellowship, song, and belief that the night, however long, would eventually end. The low chanting fades, replaced by coughing and groans, and soon the hall is restless again. You turn on your straw pallet, and as you shift, something scratches your neck. At first, you think it's the rough wool of your cloak, but then the itching grows, creeping across your skin. You slap at it, only to realize what many soldiers already knew. The very measures that kept them warm also bred endless discomfort. Lice, fleas, damp straw, and smoke were as much a part of medieval sleep as cloaks and fire. Warmth brought its own hazards. Archaeological digs of castles and barracks have unearthed countless remains of parasites, flea shells, louse combs, and even bedding stuffed with straw still infested after centuries. Written records describe the same thing. Soldiers scratched themselves raw in the night, their straw mattresses crawling with pests. No matter how tightly you wrapped your cloak, the vermin found their way inside. Warmth, tragically, created the perfect breeding ground. Imagine lying half asleep, only to feel tiny legs crawling across your scalp. You itch, scratch until you bleed, but relief never lasts. Your cloak smells of smoke and sweat, your straw damp from spilled ale or chamber pot water, and the warmth you've trapped is exactly what keeps the insects thriving. A soldier's body became both furnace and feast. One curious note comes from household manuals that recommended adding fragrant herbs to bedding, lavender, mint, wormwood believed to repel fleas. Soldiers with access to such plants might scatter them in the straw, filling the air with sharp scents. It offered some relief, but only briefly. By morning, the herbs were trampled into dust, and the pests carried on. Modern scholars remain split on how much these infestations truly affected daily life. Some argue that medieval people, so accustomed to lice and fleas, barely noticed them after a while. Others insist the misery was constant, shaping health and morale. The skeletal record suggests many soldiers carried marks of skin infections, scabs, and sores that likely came from relentless scratching. Now picture the sensory assault. You itch everywhere: neck, wrists, scalp, ankles. Around you men groan, slapping at themselves, muttering curses into the dark. The scratching becomes part of the nightly soundtrack, as familiar as snoring. Smoke adds to the torment, stinging your eyes, drying your throat, while damp straw chills your back. Every sense screams for comfort, but there is none. The damp was especially cruel. Straw absorbed moisture from spilt drink, from leaking roofs, from men sweating under cloaks. By morning, it squelched faintly under your body, clammy and sour-smelling. You cough as mildew rises, thick and choking. Some castles replaced straw regularly, others left it until it rotted. In either case, the bedding felt less like refuge and more like a compost heap. And then there was the smoke poisoning. Fires kept you alive, but the constant inhalation of soot left soldiers with hacking coughs, raspy voices, and burning eyes. You hear men clearing their throats every few minutes, spitting black phlegm into corners. Some wheeze through the night, lungs laboring against years of smoke exposure. Sleep becomes shallow, punctuated by fits of coughing that ripple across the hall like waves. Oddly enough, some men swore by smoke as protection. They claimed it kept fleas at bay or hardened the body against cold. To sleep in smoke was not just tolerated, but sometimes praised. But whether this belief was true or just resignation, the fact remained. The same fires that promised survival also sowed slow sickness. Imagine being a new recruit, unused to it all. The first night, you gag on smoke, gag again on the smell of damp straw, and lie awake scratching furiously at lice. You whisper to yourself that you'll never survive, but weeks later you no longer notice. The itching, the coughing, the stench all become background noise. Misery transforms into normality. The psychological toll lingered nonetheless. Men grew irritable, short-tempered, and quick to fight over small annoyances. A man scratching beside you could keep you awake. His cough could fray your nerves. Fights sometimes broke out in the darkness over straw, blankets, or even just the way someone breathed. The hazards of warmth weren't only physical, they tore at camaraderie. Yet soldiers endure. They invented jokes, calling lice little bedfellows or the army's smallest recruits. They laughed at each other's coughing fits, teased those who scratched most, and shared herbal remedies when they could. Humour dulled the misery, even when the skin bled and the lungs burned. Picture the hall again at midnight. Dozens of men rustle, scratch, cough, and curse in the dark. The torches sputter, shadows stretch, and the air tastes of salt, soot, and mildew. You close your eyes, trying to pretend it doesn't matter, reminding yourself that dawn always comes. You learn the brutal lesson that warmth and filth often go hand in hand, and that survival rarely feels clean. So as you pull your fresh blanket over you tonight, with clean sheets and filtered air, remember the medieval soldier curled in straw, itching from lice, coughing from smoke, and yet still clinging to life. For him, sleep was not comfort, but defiance, a stubborn act of rest in a world that offered only hazards. The itching still lingers on your skin, but your mind drifts to a darker thought. Not every castle a soldier slept in was his own. Sometimes, armies took fortresses by force, and when that happened, sleeping arrangements changed drastically. Captured castles were often colder, filthier, and more precarious than those held by their rightful lords. In these moments, men improvised wildly, turning enemy strongholds into makeshift shelters for survival. Records of sieges tell us that once a fortress fell, the victors rarely found comfortable quarters waiting for them. Fires had often been extinguished by defenders, food stores spoiled or destroyed, tapestries ripped down to prevent reuse. Soldiers who thought they'd won the night discovered themselves bedding down in the shells of ruined rooms. You might expect warmth and safety after victory, but instead, you were greeted by damp stone, broken doors, and bitter draughts. Picture yourself walking through the echoing halls of a newly conquered keep. The air still smells of smoke from battle, acrid and choking. Ash drifts from collapsed beams, mingling with the dust of rubble. Your boots crunch over shards of wood and bone-dry rushes. No prepared bedding waits for you, only ruins. You drop your pack, glance around, and decide you'll sleep on the floor with your cloak pulled tight, hoping the walls don't collapse further in the night. One curious note from chronicles is that victors often burned parts of the castle even after taking it, either to root out hidden enemies or to assert dominance. Imagine the irony. You storm a fortress for shelter, only to find yourself choking on smoke in the ruins you've created. Soldiers sometimes ended up sleeping outdoors beside smouldering rubble, the captured castle too dangerous to occupy. Archaeologists still debate how quickly armies restored captured castles to livable conditions. Some argue that victors worked immediately to repair hearths, patch windows, and set up bedding. Others insist that castles often remained ruinous for months, their conquerors enduring bitter nights with little more than cloaks and makeshift fires. Evidence of hastily built wooden huts within stone courtyards supports the latter view. Stone provided defense, but wood gave warmth. Now imagine the improvisations. Soldiers hung their cloaks across broken windows, jammed rubble into cracks, or erected tents inside ruined halls. Fires were lit in places never designed for them, corners of collapsed towers, courtyards open to the sky. The warmth was patchy, dangerous, and often insufficient. But exhaustion forced men to curl up anyway, falling asleep in rubble-strewn rooms that echoed with the ghosts of the battle just fought. The sensory details are haunting. You lie in a conquered hall, the floor littered with splinters, the walls blackened by fire. Drafts whip through gaps where doors once stood. Your cloak smells of blood and smoke, and you press it tighter, ignoring the grit beneath your cheek. Around you, men groan, some wounded, others muttering in uneasy dreams. The silence of victory feels hollow, pierced only by the crackle of fires that threaten to consume what little shelter remains. And yet, even in these bleak conditions, soldiers found ways to create ritual. Fires were ringed with stones, cloaks hung like curtains, straw salvaged from stables laid down for bedding. Some men even dragged animal carcasses inside, not just for food but for warmth, lying near them as if proximity to a dead beast still offered comfort. Survival had no shame when the cold pressed hardest. You might be surprised to know that some commanders deliberately denied their men comfort in captured castles, fearing laxity. Chroniclers record orders to sleep armed, on bare floors, without fires, to maintain readiness. The logic was cruel but clear. Better to shiver than to be caught vulnerable in enemy territory. For those nights, sleep was less rest than punishment. The psychology of captured castles weighed heavily on soldiers. Even wrapped in cloaks, even beside fires, they knew they were sleeping in another man's fortress. The walls whispered of recent death. The air carried the memory of defenders who had fallen. Some men muttered prayers, others spat curses, but all felt unease. Victory didn't erase the chill, it deepened it. Picture dawn breaking over such a place. Soldiers stir from uneasy sleep, brushing ash and dust from their cloaks. Fires smoulder weakly, leaving streaks of soot on faces. The castle feels dead, hollow, yet now it is theirs. Men stretch stiffly, coughing from smoke, still scratching at fleas. They survived the night, but it hardly feels like triumph. So when you imagine medieval soldiers resting in castles, remember that not every hall was their home. Sometimes, the coldest nights came not before a battle, but after victory. Conquered walls gave little warmth, yet men lay down anyway, wrapping themselves in cloaks and defiance, proving that sleep, no matter how miserable, was still possible even in the ruins of war. The image of ruined halls still lingers in your mind when another truth creeps in. Castles were not only places of stone and straw, but of people, crowds of them, pressed together under one roof. You shift on your pallet and notice how tightly packed the bodies are, shoulders touching, breaths mingling. Communal sleeping wasn't just an accident of space, it was the default condition of medieval life. Privacy was almost non-existent. Household records and chronicles alike reveal that soldiers, servants, and sometimes even visiting peasants all shared sleeping quarters. The great hall functioned as dining room by day and dormitory by night. When meals ended, trestle tables were cleared, straw laid down, and men sprawled wherever there was space. The idea of each person having a private bed would have seemed alien to most. Sleep was a collective act, not an individual retreat. Imagine lying down in that hall. The man on your left snores with a rattle that makes you want to shake him. The one on your right coughs into your shoulder. A boy serving as page curls up at your feet, his small body radiating warmth. Someone behind you mumbles prayers in his dreams, and across the room, two men whisper gossip in low tones. It's not just crowded, it's intimate, closer than you might ever wish to be with strangers. One odd practice noted in some accounts is that soldiers sometimes slept in alternating directions, one man's head by another's feet, forming rows of tangled limbs. The idea was practical. This arrangement packed more men into a confined space while reducing direct face-to-face breathing. But it meant waking with someone's boots by your nose, the straw rustling as your neighbor shifted in his sleep. Historians continue to debate whether such communal sleeping bred solidarity or resentment. Some argue that closeness forged bonds, turning comrades into brothers. Others suggest it wore men down, fueling quarrels, irritability, and outbreaks of violence. Archaeological evidence of garrison life shows both possibilities. Graffiti of camaraderie, etched into castle walls alongside records of brawls erupting after sleepless nights. The sensory reality of such togetherness is difficult to overstate. Heat builds quickly in a crowded hall, but so does odor. The air becomes heavy with sweat, breath, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies. You cough at the thickness of it, eyes watering, lungs tight. Yet you also feel your body warming, your shivers easing. Misery and comfort entwine in the same air. For the lowest-ranking men, communal sleeping wasn't optional. They had no claim to private corners or side rooms, but even those of higher status often shared beds. Nobles slept with retainers, siblings, or guests, partly to save space, partly for warmth, and partly because bed sharing signified trust. To invite someone into your bed was to extend intimacy, whether born of affection, obligation, or politics. A bed was both blanket and alliance. You might find it striking that even royalty was not immune. Kings often shared chambers with attendants or fellow nobles. Accounts of monarchs on campaign describe them sleeping in tents filled with courtiers, everyone pressed together on pallets despite their status. The difference lay not in solitude but in quality of bedding, fine furs and feather mattresses for the highborn, rough straw for the rest. But all breathed the same cold night air. Imagine the sound of that hall as sleep takes over. The first snores begin, then multiply, layering into a chorus. Some men mutter, others laugh briefly before drifting off. A few shuffle closer together, shoulders pressed in unconscious search of heat. You lie there, squeezed between strangers, feeling both irritated and comforted. You can't escape them, but you also can't imagine surviving without them. The lack of privacy shaped psychology. Secrets were rare. Every cough, every whisper, every nightmare was public. You learned to accept exposure as part of life, to fold yourself into the group rather than carve out solitude. Individuality shrank in the cold. Community swelled. If you hated your comrades, the night was torment. If you trusted them, the night was bearable, even safe. A few chronicles describe how men made games of it. They would wager who snored loudest, tease one another about talking in dreams, or mock those who flailed in their sleep. Laughter at night relieved tension from the day. Even bickering became part of the ritual, as familiar as the smell of smoke. And sometimes moments of unexpected tenderness emerged. A soldier might notice his comrade shivering and throw a cloak over him. Another might shift to make room for a boy too small to keep warm alone. In the middle of a harsh winter night, compassion was as practical as it was emotional, keeping one another alive, blurred with caring for one another. Picture the hall again with torches nearly burned out, shadows swaying. Dozens of men breathe together, bodies pressed close. You inhale, smell wool, smoke, sweat, and something strangely reassuring, the collective presence of others. You are not alone. Your warmth is shared, your discomfort shared, your survival shared. It is not peace, not comfort, but it is endurance. So when you slip into your own bed tonight, private and quiet, remember the medieval soldier who never knew such solitude. His nights were crowded, noisy, itchy, and stinking of bodies, but also threaded with companionship. He survived, not in silence, but in community, one body pressed against another in the cold halls of stone. The night in the crowded hall grows long, and though you are pressed shoulder to shoulder with men you barely know, you notice something else flickering through the air besides smoke and snores. It is the stories, whispered between cloaks, and the tales of miracles that seem to ripple more vividly when the cold is fiercest. In medieval castles, warmth was not only borrowed from fire and fur, but also imagined into being through belief. Legends of miraculous heat saints, relics, or holy figures who kept armies alive drifted through the dormitories like invisible blankets. Accounts from chronicles show that in times of desperate winter campaigns, men often credited survival not to their cloaks or tents, but to divine intervention. Saints were invoked by name. Saint Martin, who famously shared his cloak with a beggar, became a favorite patron of soldiers seeking warmth. Relics, splinters of the true cross, bones of martyrs, or even scraps of cloth said to have touched holy figures were carried into camps and castles. Men swore that sleeping near them brought comfort against the cold. Imagine lying on damp straw, cloak barely keeping out the frost, when someone whispers that the garrison possesses a saint's finger bone in the chapel. Word spreads, and suddenly men believe the air feels warmer, the night less merciless. Whether the relic radiates heat or simply hope hardly matters. Belief itself becomes insulation. You might be amused to know that not all these miracles were entirely spiritual. Some relics were housed in ornate reliquaries, often metal boxes that could be heated near a fire before being carried ceremonially through the hall. Soldiers clutching at the relics swore they felt divine warmth, not realizing they were holding an object that had been near flames only moments earlier. Faith and practicality blended in ways that made both more convincing. Researchers remain divided on whether these tales of miraculous warmth were exaggerations, propaganda, or rooted in genuine events. Some historians argue that monks and priests embellished such stories to strengthen faith and morale. Others suggest the experiences were real placebo perhaps, but real to the men who survived bitter nights through conviction alone. The line between miracle and psychology is blurry, and in medieval minds, there was little need to separate them. Picture yourself there, the hall dark, smoke drifting, dozens of men curled under cloaks. A chaplain enters, holding aloft a reliquary, candlelight glinting on its surface. He whispers prayers, men cross themselves, and a hush falls over the room. You feel a surge of reassurance, a sense that the cold cannot win tonight. Whether or not the temperature changes, your heart beats steadier, and your body loosens into rest. Faith becomes its own kind of fire. Legends tell of entire armies kept alive by such miracles. One story claimed that during a particularly brutal siege, soldiers who prayed to a saint awoke to find their straw warm, as if baked by the sun. Another tale spoke of a relic that glowed faintly in the night, its warmth spreading to all who touched it. Modern readers may scoff, but for men living on the edge of death, such tales carried the weight of truth. The sensory atmosphere of these nights was peculiar. Alongside the stench of sweat and smoke, you smelled incense wafting from chapels, herbs burned in rituals, or beeswax candles lit as offerings. The chanting of prayers wove with the coughing of soldiers, creating a strange blend of sacred and profane. You might wake scratching lice, yet still believe that saints hovered above you, shielding you with invisible cloaks. Oddly enough, not all miracles were Christian. In border regions where cultures mingled, soldiers borrowed charms from pagan traditions, amulets carved with runes, talismans of bone or stone, believing they held power against frost. Some even swore that certain songs or chants inherited from ancestors could warm the body if sung with conviction. In the hall, these practices blended together, each man clinging to whatever faith offered warmth. The psychology of it is powerful. When the cold was unbearable, hope itself became a survival tool. To believe that saints or spirits guarded you was to keep despair at bay, and despair, as any soldier knew, killed faster than frost. Picture again the garrison at midnight. A relic glimmers in the torchlight, passed hand to hand. Men press lips to it, close eyes, whisper promises. Around them, cloaks rustle, straw shifts, and the cold wind still seeps through cracks. Yet for a moment, no one cares. The hall feels warmer, not in degrees but in spirit. Men sleep easier, dreaming not of frostbite, but of miracles. And when morning comes, whether warmer or not, the soldiers believe they survived because of divine favor. That belief stiffens their spines, steels their courage, and carries them into another day. The miracle may not have been in the air at all, it was in the mind. So, as you drift into your own warm bed tonight, remember the medieval soldier, clinging to a story of saints or relics, wrapping himself not only in cloaks but in faith. In a world of stone and frost, sometimes belief was the thickest blanket a man could hope for. The tale of relics and saints lingers in your thoughts as the torches sputter low. You shift on the straw and realize another truth about sleeping in castles. Not all nights were spent inside. When halls grew too foul, when smoke choked the lungs or vermin overran the bedding, some men crept outdoors into courtyards or leaned against the very walls they were meant to defend. The open air was colder, yes, but sometimes the cold was less unbearable than the stench within. Contemporary descriptions of garrisons mention that soldiers often spilled into courtyards, stable yards, or even battlements to sleep. The reason wasn't always lack of space, sometimes it was choice. The hall reeked of sweat, smoke, and chamber pots. Outside, the air bit sharper but felt cleaner. In summer, especially, the cool night breeze could be relief rather than torment. Soldiers curled against walls, cloaks wrapped tight, watching stars fade into dawn. Imagine it yourself. You step outside after hours of coughing in smoke, the cold night air slapping your cheeks. You settle near a stable wall, spread your cloak, and stretch out on the hard ground. The chill creeps into your bones, but the stars overhead feel like companions, silent and steady. You shiver, but at least you breathe freely. The stone at your back is cold, but it is also solid, reassuring. You might be intrigued to know that in some accounts, guards themselves napped during watch, leaning against walls or crouching behind battlements. Officially forbidden, of course, but human exhaustion has always bent rules. A soldier nodding off with cloak pulled over his head on a parapet was a common enough sight. Punishments could be severe, but necessity often outweighed regulation. Modern historians remain divided on how widespread this outdoor sleeping really was. Some argue it was a desperate choice made only in summer or during overcrowding. Others suggest it was common practice, pointing out that many castles lacked sufficient indoor space for entire garrisons. Archaeological remains of fire pits in courtyards lend weight to the latter view. Men clearly lingered outside through long nights. The sensory world of outdoor sleep was very different. The wind cut sharper, true, but the smell of straw, sweat, and smoke was replaced by the scent of pine, dung, or damp earth. You heard owls, foxes, and the distant howl of wolves instead of the hacking coughs of comrades. You watched clouds drift across the moon, frost glittering on stone. For all its dangers, the night outdoors could feel almost peaceful compared to the suffocating chaos within. Yet danger was real. A man sleeping on the battlements risked freezing faster than one in the crowded hall. Wolves sometimes prowled close to walls, scavenging. Thieves or deserters might slip away in the dark. And always there was the threat of enemy scouts. To sleep outside was to balance relief with vulnerability, comfort with risk. Oddly enough, some soldiers found creative compromises. Chronicles mention men dragging bedding close to kitchen outbuildings, warming themselves against oven walls while still under the open sky. Others camped in stable yards, half dozing amid the warmth of animals. Outdoor sleep was rarely pure exposure. It was improvisation, seeking the exact balance between air and shelter. Picture yourself curled under a wall with your cloak pulled over your head. The stars wheel slowly above, the moon casting pale light across the courtyard. A dog lies near your feet, its body heat welcome. Your breath plumes white in the air, but the smoke of the hall is gone, the lice less biting in the cold. You drift in and out, half watching the night sky, half dreaming of warmer times. The psychology of outdoor sleep was peculiar. Some men loved it, claiming the open air restored them more than smoky halls. Others dreaded it, convinced the cold would creep into their bones and never leave. But either way, the choice revealed the desperation of medieval garrisons. To choose the bitter air over firelight and straw shows just how harsh the indoors could be. And yet, there was an odd beauty to it. Sleeping under stars, listening to night birds, a soldier could almost forget the misery of stone walls. For a fleeting moment he felt less trapped, less suffocated. The sky reminded him that the world was larger than war and castles. Perhaps that was why some chose it, even knowing the risks. So as you slip beneath your warm roof tonight, remember the medieval soldier who sometimes stepped out into the cold, preferring open sky to smoke-filled air. He shivered, yes, but he also breathed deeply, stared at stars, and found a kind of peace in the bitter chill. For him, survival wasn't just about warmth, it was also about finding a place where the soul, however briefly, could rest. The stars wheel above the courtyard, and though the open air feels cleaner than the smoky hall, you can't help but think about what fuels every small fire, every heated stone, every warm pot hugged through the night. Wood. The lifeblood of warmth in a medieval castle wasn't just cloaks and straw, it was timber cut, hauled, and burned until the last log vanished into smoke. Without it, no hearth glowed, no pot steamed, no soldier drifted into something resembling sleep. Castle accounts revealed just how precious firewood was. Winter stores were calculated with almost the same care as grain or salt meat. A large garrison could devour entire forests in a single season, burning wood for cooking by day and heating by night. Kitchens consumed the lion's share, but soldiers begged and bribed for scraps, offcuts, broken planks, even dung dried hard enough to burn. Fire was not simply comfort, it was the dividing line between endurance and collapse. Imagine trudging out into the frozen woods with an axe, breath clouding the air, boots crunching through snow. Your hands blister on the handle, your body sore from drills, yet you must gather wood or face another night of teeth-chattering misery. You drag back branches heavy with frost, praying they will dry enough to burn. When the fire finally sputters to life, you drop by it, exhausted, cloak wrapped tight, grateful for the heat that seeps slowly into your bones. Oddly enough, not all wood was equal. Oak burned long and hot, ash caught quickly, pine smoked fiercely. Soldiers learned to read wood like a second language, knowing which logs would keep embers glowing through the night and which would choke the hall with acrid smoke. Some even hoarded particular kinds of wood, hiding them under cloaks or sneaking them into corners for private fires. Historians remain divided on whether garrisons had reliable access to fuel. Some argue that castles, surrounded by forests, rarely struggled. Others point to evidence of deforestation around medieval strongholds, forests stripped bare, firewood rationed, men sent miles to gather branches. The archaeological record shows both. Some castles built with abundant timber nearby, Others perched on rocky outcrops where wood was precious as gold. Now imagine the sensory picture of firewood scarcity. A hall where the hearth glows faintly with the last embers of a single log. Dozens of men stretch out their hands, but the heat barely reaches. The shadows loom colder than the light. You lie in straw, hearing men mutter curses, some coughing deliberately to remind others of the smoke when wood was too green. The fire becomes a symbol of morale. Without it, the hall feels like a tomb. And when the wood finally ran out, then soldiers improvised. Broken carts, old furniture, even doors torn from hinges fed the flames. Chronicles describe desperate garrisons dismantling their own outbuildings, burning scaffolding, or stripping bark from trees like starving deer. Some even gathered dried animal dung, pressed into cakes that smouldered with foul smoke, but gave enough heat to keep frostbite at bay. To sleep in such a hall was to lie with nostrils full of the acrid stench of burning waste. But at least you were not dead from cold. You might be intrigued to know that some castles kept designated night fires, smaller hearths, banked carefully with ash to preserve embers until morning. Soldiers sleeping nearby could rise at midnight, stir the coals, and feel a wash of relief. But there was always the risk of embers dying too soon, leaving men scrambling in the black hours for flint and tinder to spark life into damp logs. Few things were as demoralizing as waking at midnight to find the fire gone cold. Picture the ritual of tending a night fire. A soldier kneels, prods the embers with iron, adds a splinter of kindling, and blows until sparks glow red. Around him, men stir, muttering in relief as warmth flares. The fire cracks, shadows leap, and you feel the air ease just enough to let your body relax. In those moments, the man with the fire was almost a savior. But even the best fires carried hazards. Sparks sometimes leapt into straw, igniting chaos. Soldiers woke choking as flames licked bedding, stomping and smothering before disaster spread. Too much smoke suffocated more quietly, filling halls with poison. Fires kept you alive, but they also threatened you. Sleep was never without risk, even when it came from the very flames you prayed for. The psychology of firewood scarcity ran deep. To sleep knowing the hearth might die in the night was to sleep half-worried, ears open for the sudden silence of embers. Fire was more than warmth, it was a heartbeat. Without it, the hall felt lifeless. Morale collapsed, and despair seeped in colder than frost. Close your eyes now and imagine lying near a dwindling fire. The crackle fades, the glow dims, and shadows creep closer. You pull your cloak tighter, tuck your chin into wool, and listen to men sigh as warmth ebbs away. Your body curls small, trying to conserve what little heat remains. You pray for dawn, or for someone to feed the fire before it dies. So as you rest tonight, surrounded by heating systems that never falter, think of the medieval soldier whose sleep depended on logs gathered by hand, fire coaxed by breath, and embers guarded like treasure. His comfort was as fragile as a flame on damp wood flickering, smoky, yet the only thing between survival and the killing cold. The fire sputters, its glow trembling low in the hearth. Around you, men shift uneasily, not only from cold but from the constant awareness that castles were not just places of shelter, they were targets. To sleep in a fortress was never entirely safe. You rolled yourself into a cloak, closed your eyes, and yet some part of your mind remained open, waiting for horns, bells, or screams. Defensive structures meant vigilance, and vigilance meant that rest was always fragile. Military accounts emphasize how sleep in castles was shaped by defense routines. Watch schedules carved the night into fragments, with soldiers woken for shifts on towers and gates. Even those not on duty often slept lightly, conditioned to rouse at the faintest alarm. Walls might have been thick, but fear seeped through them. Sleep was not abandonment, it was a truce with danger. Imagine lying in straw when suddenly a horn blasts from the battlements. You jolt awake, cloak tangling your limbs. Men leap up, weapons clattering, curses flying. Heart pounding, you wait for orders, only to learn it was a false alarm, a fox startled near the moat, or a shadow mistaken for raiders. Exhaustion weighs heavier after the rush, your body trembling with wasted adrenaline. Yet you know it will happen again, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps tonight. One intriguing glimpse comes from siege chronicles. Defenders often slept directly beside their posts, men on towers curled near the crenellations, archers dozing under makeshift awnings by arrow slits, gatekeepers stretched on benches with keys clutched tight in their fists. They preferred to be uncomfortable but close to duty, rather than risk being caught unready. The line between resting place and battlefield blurred in these stone strongholds. Scholars remain divided about whether this constant readiness made soldiers more disciplined or slowly eroded them. Some argue that the culture of alertness forged resilience. Men learned to thrive on scraps of rest, toughened by constant drills. Others contend it hollowed out morale, creating weary garrisons more prone to mistakes and mutiny. Archaeology lends weight to both, with evidence of fatigue written into records of botched defences, and yet also into stories of astonishing endurance. Picture the sensory landscape of defensive nights. On the wall, boots creak on frosted stone. Spears thud against parapets as men shift their weight. Below, dogs bark in the courtyards, hooves clatter in stables as horses stir at unseen movements. In the hall, men twitch even in dreams, ears tuned to the smallest sound. You hear snores punctured by sudden silences as soldiers half wake, listening. Sleep becomes fractured, like glass splintered but never shattered. You might be surprised to know that some commanders deliberately kept noise alive through the night drums beaten at intervals, bells rung, or guards calling to one another from tower to tower. The point wasn't only security. It was to remind every soldier that vigilance never ceased. For those trying to sleep, it meant dreams were punctuated by reminders of duty. Peace and vigilance coexisted awkwardly, the two halves of fortress life. The psychology of such nights is heavy. Soldiers joked bitterly about never getting proper rest, but their laughter was thin. To live in constant half-readiness meant never sinking into true dreams, never letting the body fully repair. In time, your limbs ached not from labor, but from exhaustion. Yet paradoxically, some men found reassurance in it. The noise, the alarms, the constant shuffling of guards, all proof the fortress was alive, awake, protecting them even as they lay still. Oddly enough, religious ritual blended with defense. Bells tolling for night prayers doubled as signals for watch shifts. Monks in attached chapels prayed while soldiers kept guard, both serving the same purpose: to ensure that no hour of night passed unguarded. Sacred duty and martial duty blurred, shaping an atmosphere where even sleep felt like a task performed under higher authority. Imagine yourself dozing near a gatehouse. The smell of damp wood, iron, and torches fills your nose. A fellow soldier nudges you awake, your turn to watch. You stumble to the wall, cloak pulled tight, bow in hand. You stare into darkness until your eyes ache, listening for the crunch of feet in snow. Hours later, another man relieves you, and you stagger back inside to collapse in straw. You don't dream, you plunge into blackness, your body borrowing whatever scraps of rest it can before duty drags you up again. The rhythm of such life shaped whole campaigns. Armies weren't only limited by food or weather, but by exhaustion. A castle garrison too worn down by sleepless nights might surrender even when its walls held strong. Leaders knew this, and so they rationed not only grain but also sleep. Who slept where? Who was woken when? Who got to rest closest to the fire? All became questions of command and survival. So, as you lay yourself in bed tonight, perhaps irritated by a late-night noise or an early alarm, remember the medieval soldier whose sleep was constantly fragile, balanced between vigilance and collapse. His bed of straw was never only for rest. It was also a place to keep one ear open for horns, bells, or the scrape of enemies in the dark. The horns quiet, the fires dim, and the castle settles into that peculiar stillness that only comes in the darkest stretch of night. You shift in the straw, eyes heavy, and it strikes you how much of survival in these halls was less about grand comforts and more about small adjustments, rituals, habits, and little human tricks to make misery bearable. By the time the medieval soldier lay down, he had already rehearsed an entire repertoire of strategies, layering cloaks, huddling against comrades, stuffing rags into drafts, cuddling stones, or even roasted vegetables. None of it offered true warmth. What it offered instead was enough. Household accounts and garrison reports show that castles functioned less as homes than as machines for endurance. Sleep was never perfect, never restorative in the modern sense. It was patched together like the bedding itself, bits of straw, scraps of fur, fragments of rest. And yet, through this patchwork, men managed to endure brutal winters without vanishing into frost. Imagine lying there, straw rustling as you shift, your nose numb but your chest still faintly warm from the fire earlier. You know you'll wake in a few hours to your watch, or to coughing fits, or to scratching from lice. But for now, you let yourself sink just a little deeper, because this is the closest to comfort you'll find. One striking practice described in some chronicles was the deliberate pairing of soldiers as sleeping partners. Two men wrapped themselves in the same cloak or blanket, pressing back to back for shared body heat. To us, it may seem awkward, but to them, it was simple logic. Two bodies meant less heat lost to the air. A man who refused such closeness risked more than discomfort. He risked death by cold. And yet, not everyone accepted it gladly. Chroniclers mention quarrels sparked over who was forced to share with whom, laughter when one man kicked in his sleep, even punishments for those who disturbed others with restless thrashing. Communal survival created intimacy, but also friction. Still, when the frost grew sharp, few refused the arrangement for long. The debate among historians continues about how much of this nightly survival was conscious planning versus instinct. Did men think carefully about every measure, who to sleep beside, where to place stones, how to bank fires, or did they simply stumble into whatever scraps of warmth they could find? Some argue for the former, pointing to written advice in manuals and records of household management. Others argue for the latter, suggesting that improvisation ruled the night. Either way, the result was the same. Exhaustion carried men through, with just enough comfort to stop them freezing entirely. The sensory world of these strategies was messy. Cloaks grew stiff with frost where men's breath condensed. Shared heat meant the smell of another man's sweat pressed against your face. Draft-stuffed cracks smelled of dung or straw. Warm stones left scorch marks on cloaks, while chamber pots filled with water for heating sometimes leaked into the bedding. Sleep was not clean, not fragrant, not peaceful. It was raw survival, stitched from dozens of half-effective measures. Oddly enough, some of these methods echoed into later centuries. Even in early modern Europe, soldiers carried sleeping sacks designed for two men, recreating the medieval practice of body sharing. The medieval solutions were so pragmatic that they outlasted their age, resurfacing whenever cold and scarcity pressed hardest. Picture the castle hall now, its 100 small improvisations layered together. Cloaks pulled over heads, straw stuffed against walls, herbs sprinkled in bedding, stones glowing faintly, men curled in clusters like animals in a den. The fire in the hearth sighs, smoke, drafts still whistle through cracks, and coughing echoes faintly, but through it all, men sleep. Not well, not luxuriously, but enough to face the dawn. The psychology of this cannot be overstated. To accept that misery was normal was itself a survival skill. Soldiers didn't expect softness. They expected cold, hunger, and noise. The small comforts, a warmed pot, a borrowed cloak, a whispered prayer, were magnified by deprivation, turned into treasures. Hope didn't come from erasing discomfort, but from finding moments where discomfort dulled. And so you drift, in imagination, into the rhythm of their world. Sleep broken by watch duty, warmth traded for smoke, straw traded for vermin, privacy traded for survival. Yet somehow, night after night, soldiers endured. When dawn broke, the hall reeked of smoke, sweat, and straw. Men stirred, stiff and aching, eyes red from smoke and sleeplessness. But they rose, buckled on armor, and carried out orders. They had survived another night in stone walls that cared little for their comfort. That was triumph enough. Now, dim the lights. Let your body loosen, your breath slow, your eyes close. Picture the castle fading behind you, the smoke thinning, the snoring softening, the drafts falling still. You are not on stone straw tonight. You are wrapped in clean fabric, in silence, in warmth that does not vanish when the fire dies. The struggles of medieval soldiers are behind you, woven into history, lessons of resilience carved into cold stone. Allow yourself to imagine them not as miserable wretches but as fellow dreamers who, despite everything, still found rest where they could. Let their resourcefulness be a quiet reassurance. If they could sleep through smoke, lice, and fear, you too can let go of today's noise. The fire inside your own home hums steady. The air is soft. The sheets are gentle. You are safe, warmer than any knight in his feathered bed, warmer than any soldier in his smoky hall. You have what they longed for, true rest. So breathe slowly. The night outside is vast but harmless. Let the stone walls of history dissolve into the distance. Let warmth cradle you. Let sleep arrive, not as defiance, but as welcome peace. Sweet dreams until morning comes.